Good morning and a warm welcome to everybody who's in the room here today in the US, as well as those who are online. Joining us for day 2 of our joint Good Clinical Practice and Pharmacovigilance Compliance Workshop. And it's a pleasure to join you for what I'm sure will be a very enjoyable and informative day for all of us. We'll continue the discussions on good clinical practice today. And that will be building on the important topics that we covered yesterday, which included the harmonisation and the ICH E6 GCP guideline, technology in clinical trials and digital health technology, decentralised trials, and data governance. So in terms of day 2, what we'll be starting in terms of the discussions will be around oversight. And that changes to all of the work that we do. In many cases, those changes are a result of the challenges faced during the global pandemic of the last several years, and how regulators are working together to collaborate to improve our work and engaging with our stakeholders in that process. Clinical trial oversight is not just about what regulators do, it is also the responsibility of the clinical trial sponsor. And it is a complex undertaking, especially as we see more technology applications, specialist vendors, and outsourcing, meaning that the clinical trial itself has many moving parts, and there are challenges to ensuring the safety of patients and the very important generation of reliable evidence and data. The global pandemic challenged all of us across countries and societies. A crisis of the scale of the pandemic drove rapid innovation across the medicines and healthcare ecosystem, and clinical trials did not escape from that disruption and innovation. Clinical trials played a critical role in the development of new vaccines for COVID-19, therapeutics, and treatments. And new and agile and flexible ways of working were required not only from those conducting clinical trials, but also from the regulators to ensure the success of those clinical trials. We will hear about how this initial disruption created opportunities for longer-term positive change, including how inspections are conducted and on the use of remote inspection technologies and the future of these types of approaches. Another theme we'll be discussing today is collaboration between regulators. And that is something that's incredibly important, as well as the communication and meaningful engagement with stakeholders. We will hear about new initiatives and updates from each of the regulatory agencies participating today, and how we collaborate and maximize the benefit of that joint working for patients. We will be hearing updates from FDA and Health Canada on various agency policies and initiatives. And one of my colleagues from MHRA will be giving an update on our own compliance strategy, newly developed over the course of 22 and 23, and that forming a key part of MHRA's corporate plan out to 2025 and to beyond. The agency is looking to evolve our approaches to compliance as medicines and technology evolves, developing potentially outcome-based approaches, and ones that seek to engage early and upstream with those conducting trials to prevent issues before they occur. And where a collaboration with trusted regulatory partners will be of increasing importance in a global trials environment, and with our shared objectives to ensure patient safety and public health. So in terms of today's agenda, what we will be covering sponsor oversight, clinical trials post-pandemic, the future of GCP inspections, regulatory updates and collaboration, and then we'll be concluding with a panel discussion from the speakers that will be participating in today's workshop. It is a pleasure to have joined you for today's workshop, and I'm very much looking forward to the many informative discussions from all 3 regulators. And please do use this as an opportunity to engage on the important topics that we'll be covering and enjoy the rest of today's event. I'd like to thank you for attending and now pass to my colleague, Lakeisha.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening to others. Again, my name is Commander Lakeisha Williams. I had the privilege and pleasure of speaking with you yesterday. Thank you, James, so much for that riveting opening remarks. As you mentioned, we do have a packed schedule for day 2, so we really hope you enjoy it, as a lot of work has gone into the planning for day 2 also. So now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing session 1 panelists, which will cover sponsor oversight in clinical trials. The moderator for this is Dr. Adil Nashed. He's the Regulatory Operations Enforcement Branch Compliance Officer from Health Canada. He will be joined by our very own Barbara Wright, the Foreign Cadre Director for FDA, and following with James Wakeland Smith, the Expert GCP Inspector, Head of Compliance Expert Circle with MHRA. So I would like to welcome them to the stage to kick us off with session 1. Thanks again, everyone. Enjoy.
Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the US-FDA for hosting and for having us. And today's presentation will be delivered by myself, Adil Nashed, and my 2 colleagues, Barbara Wright and Jason Wakeland-Smith. I'll be speaking to you about the sponsor role and oversight responsibilities in global clinical trials, including those trials incorporating novel designs, operational approaches, and data sources, such as RWD and RWE. Barbara will be talking about expanding the use of third parties and service providers performing clinical trial-related activities. And Jason will be the last but not least, will be talking about risk-proportionate oversight measures that will focus on what's important to ensure reliable trial results, trial participant safety, and appropriate decision-making. So, for my presentation, I'll first talk about the overview of the presentation. I'll talk about the clinical trial global status. I'll talk about the new trial designs, and the specific one I'll be talking about today is the adaptive design, and I'll be also touching on the RWD and RWE. Next, I'll be talking about the sponsor oversight and how it's applicable to both the adaptive design and the RWD and RWE. Next, I'll be talking about verifiers of compliance, and this is what the inspectors look for. And last, I will speak about the ICH update. Sponsor obligations. We know that the sponsor is responsible for the overall conduct of the trial. We heard that yesterday also. We know that sponsor can delegate tasks to third parties, however, they cannot delegate responsibilities, and I know my colleague Barbara will speak on this topic. And lastly, we know that the sponsor is responsible for compliance with the applicable regulations, and in Canada, Division 5 of the Canadian Food and Drugs Regulations is the legislation that we enforce for GCP inspections. So, global status of clinical trials. What's happening globally with clinical trials? Well, they're becoming more complex. You ask why? They're now engaging, or they're asking for novel design or new trials. Adaptive design is one of them. More trials are utilizing RWD, RWE, and more trials are utilizing artificial intelligence and machine learning. In Canada, we find that Canadian stakeholders are asking for increasing need to conduct clinical trials using novel designs, and they're asking to change or to increase regulatory coherence across a distinct drug. For us, Health Canada, we recognize the need for regulatory framework that will provide greater transparency, efficiency for stakeholders. So what's new in ICH E6R3 specifically when it comes to the design of the trials? This is specifically for the sponsor oversight. We find that under the type and design of the trial, adaptive design, platform, umbrella basket, decentralized trials have been added, and that's why we're talking today about adaptive design. Also, under criteria for discontinuation of the trial, we find that the dose adjustment and dose interruption has been added. This is all in R3. And the last one is identification of the data entered in case report forms is to be removed. This is from R3 to R2. So let's go to the essence of the topic, adaptive design trials. So it's a design that allows for planned modifications. In essence, adaptive design is defined as a clinical trial design that allows for prospectively planned modifications to one or more aspects of the design based on accumulating data from the subject in the trial. That's very important. It's a seamless design that allows for planned changes. In essence, these changes have to be occurring at pre-specified times during the trial or the life cycle of the trial. Modifications cannot take place at any given time. They have to be pre-planned. And also, adaptations have to be pre-planned as well. Types of adaptive design trials. There's quite a few of them. I picked four for the case of, for the sake of time for this presentation. I picked four that I'll be expanding on. The number one is adaptive randomization design. Adaptive randomization design. What's this design? This design allows alteration to the randomization schedule. And based on varied probabilities of the treatment assignment. The purpose of this is basically to increase the probability of success. Next one is group sequential design. What's this? It's a design that allows the stoppage of the trial completely or prematurely when there is issues with the safety and efficacy. And then depending on the results from the analysis, modifications can be made. Adaptive dose finding design. Is this design, you are identifying the minimum dose and the maximum tolerable dose. And from that, you can determine the dose level for the next phase trials. This design is typically used in early phase trials. Last one is adaptive treatment switching design. And in this design, you can switch patients or participants from one treatment arm to the other, if, again, there are concerns with safety and efficacy. In this type of designs, estimation of survival rate could be difficult if the disease in question has poor prognosis. Advantages of adaptive design trials: flexibility, efficiency, ability to stop the study earlier if proved to be non-effective, better understanding of drug effects, more acceptable to stakeholders. I'm going to stop at the first two bullets, flexibility and efficiency. In a conventional study, when a sponsor is applying for approval, during the course of the trial, if there is amendments, the sponsor is required to submit a protocol amendment to the regulator. And in Health Canada, we issue a letter of no objection. So that if the amendments are to be applied for, the sponsor has to wait until they get approval from the regulator. In this case, I'm using Health Canada as an example. For this one, adaptive designs, the potential modifications are approved beforehand by both the regulator and the ethics committee. That's more flexibility, because otherwise, conventionally, a sponsor has to wait to apply for the amendment, and they have to wait till they get the approval before they can implement the amendments. For the efficiency, participants are used more efficiently, and fewer participants, if you may, are given ineffective compounds or ineffective doses that potentially be high. At the same time, pharma companies may use or waste less unsuccessful compounds and can more quickly reassign resources to alternative drugs within their pipelines. So let's compare conventional versus adaptive design trials. Conventional study has a rigid, yes, but very simple study design. Adaptive, on the other hand, has flexible but more complicated. Conventional study for phase 1 to 2 are well defined, while for adaptive can be seamless for phase 2 and 3. For conventional study, the regulatory review is well endorsed, while for adaptive, it's still speculative. Let's talk about limitations of adaptive design. Are there limitations? Yes, there are limitations. And I picked again 4 for the sake of the timelines imposed on this presentation. And the first one, they may require specific analytical methods that may not be readily available. Next, some efficiency aspect of the design, yes, but you can lose efficiency on another part of the trial. I'm gonna expand on this in a minute. Next one, there could be some challenges with logistics. And the last one, there could be challenges with interpretability of the results. It's a complex design, so there might be challenges there to interpret the results. I want to give an example on the efficiency and how there could be some issues with efficiency, specifically statistics, and when you apply this to the randomization. If we use an example of adaptive randomization versus the fixed randomization, it was found that if you're using fixed randomization, you are able to have more precise estimate of the treatment. For example, if you have 100 subjects in a trial, and you are going to split 50 in one arm, experimental, and 50 in the other arm, control. This is the fixed one, or the conventional fixed randomization. On the other one, the adaptive design, you will use different number of subjects. So let's say for one arm, experimentally, you're going to use 90 participants, and the other arm, you're going to use or apply 10 participants. It was found that for the one that has used the fixed randomization, you're able to have a more precise estimate of the treatment. And also for the adaptive randomization, it has to be larger and taking longer. So this is just one example to give you about the inefficiency when it came to statistics, when you apply it to randomization for the adaptive design. So in a nutshell, you are having a more precise estimate of the treatment when you're using the fixed randomization. In the example, when you're using the same number of subjects, for example, 50 participants in each arm, 50-50. All right, sponsor oversight. So right now, there aren't any changes for the sponsor oversight because it's still a new topic, and ICH is yet working to approve a document specifically for adaptive design. So the same requirement that we're basically expecting or enforcing will apply. Meaning, there has to be quality of the design of the trial. The sponsor has to ensure that trial processes are compliant with this new design. There has to be a criteria for protocol deviations. There has to be decisions made impacting subject safety and data integrity. Next, selection of qualified individuals. This is very important. Sponsor must ensure that site staff are trained on this design. And we do verify this during our inspections because Health Canada Division 5, CO510G talks about the qualifications of staff engaged in a trial. They should be qualified by education training and experience. So if you have a new design, the staff at the site should be well trained by the sponsor on it. That's very important. There should be prompt implementation of CAPA. There should establish IDMC, Independent Data Committee, Data Monitoring Committee, when applicable. They should establish the endpoints, and there could be any committees recruited should have written SOPs. In a nutshell, also, the sponsor should have early communication. If the sponsor is considering conducting this new design, they should have early communication with the respective regulator. They should have a rationale. They should have a detailed description of the adaptation plan. And also, they should have information of the responsibilities of the bodies responsible for the implementation of this new design. Verification of compliance. For adaptive design trials, verify the design is approved by the regulator. That cannot implement any design unless that design is approved by the regulator. Next, the approved design has to be followed by the site. So the site must follow whatever the regulator has approved for them, and we check for that. In Health Canada section CO510B talks about the trial must follow the protocol. The design should follow or should be applied to all the sites. You can't have the design applied to only one site and others not, because that might impact the quality of the data. Obviously, verify the REB was informed and approved the design. And also, the monitoring has to be conducted, a design to be applied for all the sites. So this is, in a nutshell, about adaptive design. Think of it as a more flexible design, but it's more complex. It's pre-planned based on data coming from the subject. This is the summary or of this important thing about adaptive design. I'll speak next about RWE and RWD. You might have heard this yesterday by some of the colleagues who spoke about it. So real-world evidence is evidence about the use and potential benefits or risk of a medical product. This evidence is coming from where? It's coming from the analysis of the real-world data, which is data relating to the subject or the patient status and or delivery of health care routinely collected from a variety of sources. Real-world data refers to health-related data that's generated from the course of a patient routine care or post-treatment. And you will be surprised, but there's a large number of sources for this RWD. They could come from the healthcare records, insurance claims, billing activity, medication order records, patients' own data generation via wearables or other at-home medical devices. So there's quite a large number of sources by which you can get this RWD. So in this slide here, I'm showing you that RWD will lead to RWE. So the real-world evidence is coming from the real-world data. It's evidence that you are gathering from the real-world data. So what are the benefits of the real world in clinical trials? Well, gain insight into public health, advanced healthcare, increase drug access for specific patient populations, increase trials visibility. Data collected from clinical trials has some limitations. When we want to compare RWD and RWE and compare it with the clinical trial data, we know the following, that data that's collected from clinical trial is really very high quality controlled data because it's coming from, but the fact it's coming from a specific patient population and highly specialized environment is limiting the generalizability in real world settings. Also, clinical trials might not be always feasible or ethical for certain diseases or disorders as rare diseases, and some patient populations, for example, children, pregnant women, and seniors. The sponsor oversight. Well, it has to be identified in a cover letter. You have to explain why the RWE, RWD was being used. You have to explain how it was gathered. You have to explain or demonstrate how potential biases were mitigated. So, verification of compliance. How do we verify compliance here about this RWE and RWD? Again, I don't want to overlap. We heard yesterday colleagues that spoke to us about the life cycle of data. For the compliance here, we want to verify the source of the RWD. We want to verify the storage of the RWD. We want to verify the reliability of the RWD, basically ARCOAC, accurate, legible, complete, original, attributable, and contemporaneous. And you want to verify the qualification of staff who collected the RWD. Again, it's very important that staff who are engaged in this are qualified, as the same with the adaptive design. All the staff have to be qualified, all the staff have to be trained, and also for the sponsor, when they're hiring monitors, the monitors themselves have to be trained on this kind of adaptive designs or the RWE, RWD. That's very important, and we do check for that, like I said earlier. Last thing, what's happening with the ICH update currently? It's a new topic. As we speak, there is no full harmonization between some regulators, and ICH is working on developing guidelines. The anticipated completion is next year. And that brings me to the conclusion of this presentation. I want to thank you all for listening, and I want to present to you my next colleague, Barbara Wright. Thank you.
Hi, so next up, I'd like to talk about the expanded use of contractors and service providers in clinical trials today. I'll start with some discussion of the oversight obligations that sponsors have, talk about the importance of written agreements in those engagements, and then close with a couple of examples from global inspections done by FDA. So let's go. So contract services, traditionally we've seen a lot of areas where contractors have been used in clinical trials. So we've seen site selection and monitoring. We've seen central laboratories used, central radiologists conducting interpretations, IP or investigational product distribution and management, data management, statistics. So those are typically the areas that we've seen over the years in clinical trials, but what we're seeing a lot more of now is the growth areas associated with remote data acquisition. So we heard a lot of discussion yesterday about digital health technologies and how those are used in clinical trials now. Most of those are through the use of some vendor or service provider. So when patients are capturing their symptoms, so the efficacy endpoints in diaries, cell phone apps, wearable devices, tablets at the clinic, when these endpoint data is captured through these electronic devices, a lot of times those are through these third-party service providers. So this is a big growth area in service providers and clinical research. We're also seeing the expanded use of what we call site management organizations, where contract staff are hired to perform tasks at a clinical investigator site, or contractors are used to collect subject level data, sometimes through electronic technologies, or to perform, say, patient, we talked about adaptive or decentralized clinical trials yesterday. and the use of home health nurses, for example, to go to the study subject's home and administer drug or collect efficacy assessments, collect blood samples so you could have a contract phlebotomist. So this is another area where we see kind of the expanded use of service providers. We're seeing as many as 30, 40 different contractors engaged in a single trial. So it's a lot to keep track of and a lot to consider, a lot for the sponsors to stop and think about and take a thoughtful, risk-based approach to setting up the activities for oversight in that trial. So hit the right button and we'll go. So yesterday we talked a little bit ICH R3. It addresses the use of these service providers in the agreement section. There's a lot of good detail there. I encourage you to read that in the R3 draft. The R2 document also talked about contract research organizations. It outlines the fact that the sponsors retain ultimate responsibility for the trial. I'm going to say that about 12 times in my slide deck. So they can delegate a task. And they can even transfer responsibility through an agreement, and we can hold the contract research organization responsible under our regulations, but that still doesn't absolve the sponsor of responsibility for overseeing the trial. So those transfers ought to be in writing. They should be in adequate detail, and a lot of times you're going to need some associated plans to go with that, and then you have to follow that up with oversight. And yeah, so follow that with oversight to assure that the plan is actually followed. So considerations to look at when contracting services for global clinical trials. Well-written contracts and study plans are going to be essential. And I talk about both because depending on the task and activity, the plan needs to contain adequate detail. I mean, you can't put everything in a contract, right? And no matter what you do to sit down and think about everything that's important to consider and define and train the staff on, you're still going to forget something. So you're still going to need to oversee the execution of those plans. But the contracts and the plans are going to go together: monitoring plans, data management plans, even communication plans, something we probably don't talk enough about. But well-written contracts that include all of the risks when you're taking this risk-based approach, risk to subjects, risk to data, those need to be considered when you're setting up those plans and agreements. And then training people, if you've got a document but nobody's read it and knows what's in it, then you can't expect success when you get to the end of the trial, right? So we need to train the staff. We need to communicate on a regular basis, and we need to check in to make sure that we're on course. If we check in early enough, we can make course corrections. If we wait till the end of the trial, we might end up at a destination no one planned. So. And from the regulator standpoint, we talked a lot about data being fit for purpose. When you get to the end of the trial, we need the study data to have been collected in a way that we can reconstruct the study and have confidence in the data that's coming in the marketing applications. So we're looking for that data to be organized and accessible, but also attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate. Thank you. Audience participation part. Okay, we've also got complete, consistent, enduring, and available. So we could go on and on about all of the characteristics of high quality data, but essentially we're all looking for the same thing, right? We want to know that we can trust the end product. And so to do that, we need to put a lot of thought up front into how are we going to assure that we can have confidence in the end result. So in setting up these agreements for the execution of these trials, there's a lot to consider. Critical roles and responsibilities need to be defined in these agreements and the plans. So some of the things that the sponsor needs to consider, like, is the plan in adequate detail, right? If it's too vague, then we can't expect people to follow, to know what to do, right? So it needs to be, we don't want to leave too much to interpretation. That increases risk to the data and to the subjects. So we want to make sure that all of the roles and responsibilities are assigned in that plan. We want to make sure that the sponsor retains adequate control over the study. So when you hire a contractor, you can't just hand off and walk away, right? You have to make sure that they understand what you expect them to do, and you have to check in on that. Important part of that is being a part of the key documents associated with that service, right? So the sponsor should retain some involvement in the training plans for the staff. So they should need to know that when they hand off a task to a contract service provider, that the service provider is going to ensure that the staff is qualified and trained, understands, and that the sponsor is also involved in any key documents that assure the accurate completion of those tasks. It's also important for the sponsor to know if their service provider is going to hire a subcontractor, or I talk about the subcontractors of subcontractors of subcontractors. With each delegation of those tasks, does the sponsor retain knowledge of those delegations, and do they retain adequate control and access to the data? So has the task been delegated to someone who hired a subcontractor, and now we can't get at the data to verify its accuracy and authenticity? So the sponsor still needs to be able to access that data, even if a subcontractor is used. And they still need to be able to assure that the data has been protected and maintained in compliance with federal regulations. So they should know when a service provider is going to hire additional subcontractors to assist in the tasks that they've been contracted to perform. There we go. So it's important for the sponsor to know if there are going to be limitations, maybe by privacy laws in that region. Maybe there are institutional policies that they need to verify that they're going to be able to access the data come the end of the trial or during the trial to monitor its progress. So institutional policies, there are also in some regions, there may be IT challenges, right, for software or hardware. They may not be able to communicate as well with these sites, may have some limitations in how they can access the data in real time to oversee it, or at the end of the study to make sure that that data is adequately retained. So when thinking about setting up these vendor oversight activities, as we talked yesterday about taking a risk-based approach to things, the sponsor needs to consider all the risks to the study subjects. Now, those can be clinical risks, well-being, the subject's well-being, and those could also be risks to privacy, patient privacy, and the inadvertent release of personal information. Also, they need to consider risk to data, right? So the data system needs to have adequate security, the audit trails, the backup systems, the validated transfer protocols, all of those things that we look at to assure that the data has integrity, that it's not being protected over the entire life cycle from collection to retention. The sponsor needs to consider what do they need to verify that their vendors are going to be compliant in these areas of subject and data protection. When they decide to engage in the oversight activities, the question they have to consider is, how much is enough, right? It's going to be based on the risks associated with what the vendor is performing. So are they determining eligibility? If we get the wrong patient in the trial, it doesn't matter what we do with the data beyond that point. It's kind of useless, right? So are they doing eligibility? Are they managing IP? What tasks is this service provider being involved in, and how critical are those to the execution of the trial? That's going to determine how detailed they need to be when they're assessing prior to engaging with the service provider. So the site selection, can they just send a questionnaire? Do they need to go make a site visit? Can they visit at the beginning and the end of the trial, or do they need to make interim visits? This is all going to be based on what are we asking this vendor to provide, and how critical is it to the success of the trial. So yesterday we talked about digital health technologies, and the guidance on digital health technologies, and the discussions yesterday talked about some of the things to consider. So just as an example, if you're engaging in one of the agreements with one of these service providers, things to consider are looking at what's going to be considered source data and how are we going to assure access for both the sponsor and the regulator. Because if we can't go back in and reconstruct the study and verify its reliability for the marketing application, that's going to be a problem. We need to make sure that all that metadata is available, that it's maintained, reviewed, and retained, right? So it doesn't do any good to have an audit trail if nobody's looking at it. So there was a little discussion about that yesterday in the case studies about the vendor or the sponsor having some kind of algorithm or process of looking at the data for anomalies over the course of the trial. So we need to assure that clinical and privacy risk we talked about with these digital health tools, this digital data, patient information, their personal addresses, make sure that their privacy is protected in setting those up, and then assuring adequate validation, usability, evaluations of the devices. So if you're doing a clinical research study involving university students, for example, here on the campus, University of Maryland, and they've got internet access and they're tech savvy and they've got all kinds of apps on their phone, that's a different patient population. Those are different assessment of the reliability of the devices for that patient population that if you're dealing with an elderly population that's not very tech savvy, or a poor population where they have unreliable internet. What are you going to do when they don't have internet and can't make connections and upload the data? Is the device going to retain the data and transmit it when that connection is available? So there's a lot to consider, and it's going to be risk-based, right? It's going to be based on the study, what the vendor's being asked to do, and the conditions of that study. So some of the significant challenges that we've seen in recent inspections are related to mishandling, mismanagement, and lack of accessibility to study data. Under FDA's regulations, subject level data is the responsibility of investigators. So in the classic sense, the investigators are the ones who are collecting the data from the patients. They're the ones treating the patient. Well, but in the modern trials, we're seeing the involvement of service providers in a lot of those functions, right? A lot of the efficacy endpoints, maybe the dosing records, are going to be collected by these third-party vendors. It's important to note that that's still investigator data. It's still subject level data, and there's an expectation that that data resides with the investigator. In some cases, that data is going to be blinded. The investigator can't have access to it during the trial, but at least by the end of the trial, that data should reside with the investigator. The investigator should be informed if the sponsor is engaging into a service contract with someone who's going to be collecting subject level data or involved in subject level activities. So that since those are investigator responsibilities, the investigator should be aware of those tasks. It ought to be outlined in the protocol, frankly, but they need to be aware and they need to have access to that data. Anything else that's that subject level data, the regulator is going to expect to have access to via the sponsor. They may use multiple vendors to collect data, but since the sponsor has an oversight function, we expect them to at least be able to understand the key task performed by those service providers and have access to the data that's submitted in the marketing application. So we should be able to reconstruct the study from the sponsor site or through the sponsor, even if they have to engage with the vendors during our site visits and the sponsor inspections. So. And lastly, I think we're seeing, especially with the real-world data, the increase of real-world data in clinical trials, we see transfers of studies from one sponsor to another, or to an applicant. And it's important when there is that transfer of study data, either during an active trial or after the trial's been completed, it's important for the sponsor to verify that that data is fit for purpose before it comes to the agency in a marketing application. So if it doesn't meet the criteria, you know, we've talked a lot about what the study criteria should be, what the data criteria, the ALCOA principles of that data. If we can't access the data to verify it, if it doesn't meet the electronic data standards for data integrity, then the sponsor needs to assure that those procedures, those standards are met before they include that data into a marketing application. There we go. So next up, I'd just like to talk about a few cases that we've had in our global inspections. And the first one is we went to a sponsor, a pharmaceutical sponsor inspection, and the sponsor in this case had engaged with a service provider for monitoring activities, very common area, right, for service providers. Well, our inspection revealed that the vendor failed to meet a schedule of visits. And in their visits to the sites for monitoring, they didn't, the scope of the coverage was very limited. Because they didn't comply with the schedule of monitoring visits, then they didn't identify the non-compliances early enough in the trial, and they didn't secure compliance from the investigators. And they didn't act to terminate the investigator site, right? That's our expectation, is that when you see an investigator not following the study protocol, you bring them into compliance as quickly as you can. And if you can't, then we expect you to terminate that investigator. It's important to the safety of the patients, study subjects enrolled in the trial, and it's important to retain the integrity of the data. So in this case, that non-compliance wasn't identified early enough because the study schedule wasn't complied with. Our investigator found that ineligible subjects, based on either their medication history prior to enrollment, their con meds at the time of enrollment, or their disease status, they didn't meet the eligibility criteria for the trial. So that this happened at multiple sites during the study. And our investigator noted there were multiple events where there was either an underdosing or an overdosing of study subjects, again, at multiple sites, not an isolated incident. She identified that looked at the training provided by the sponsor to the contractor, and it appeared to be inadequate. Also, the fact that these were not isolated incidents, that they were multiple sites, indicates that these were central source to these problems, right? So, I guess the question I have is, for a site like this is, what wasn't done in setting this up? Clearly, there wasn't a good training plan. The sponsor had SOPs, the sponsor had a monitoring plan, but the sponsor failed to properly oversee that vendor and make sure that that they were following that plan, right? The one thing you can count on with a plan is that it's not going to be completely followed. Life is going to happen, and that's why there's an oversight requirement. So at the end of that study, the end result is we've got a data set that isn't reliable because it's got subjects that shouldn't have been enrolled, and we've got underdosing and overdosing, so it's hard to make conclusions from that. Not only did we fail to follow good clinical practices here, but we failed to protect the safety, rights, and welfare of the subjects that were enrolled in that trial, right? So significant concern in that case. So another case, actually there were two, and I'm going to say medical device trials. I recognize this, we're talking about pharmaceutical trials, but they're very similar. Similar situations can occur in drug trials, but we had two sponsors that engaged with contractors engaged with sites to conduct studies, and they retain responsibility for monitoring. But what we found when we went to conduct these studies is that when the sponsors engaged with these clinical investigators, they did not assure that their agreements covered everything that they needed to access the source data. There were regional privacy considerations, and neither the sponsor was able to monitor those sites and verify the authenticity of the data, nor was FDA able to go and look at those records and verify the accuracy. What the investigator sites had done was extract data from the patient record and put it into an unsecured spreadsheet and provide the spreadsheet as source, as a base for electronic case report forms. But there are no user access controls, there are no audit trails, there's no confidence that the data in that unsecured spreadsheet was accurately recorded and transferred into the ECRFs. So in the end, again, this data was provided to us, and it couldn't be verified, and if we can't verify it, it's not really fit for purpose. Lastly, we've been talking about DHTs, so I'll give an example of electronic diaries, which have become very common. So in this particular trial, the patient-reported outcomes, the symptoms, were to be recorded in electronic diaries through a service provider, through a vendor. The investigator could access a portal online and could see whether the patient was reporting their symptoms at the required intervals. And when the patients missed an interval, an email notice was sent to the investigator to notify them there was a gap in the data. Please reach out and fill that gap, right? We need this, we need the patient's symptoms at this time point. And so the process that was set up is that they would have retroactive entries through a paper system that would go through the CRO and be entered into the data set. What we found when we did the clinical investigator inspections is the clinical investigators failed to retain the emails. They didn't see them as a critical study record, so they didn't retain the emails, but they also didn't act on them all the time. They failed to go back to the study subjects and solicit these missed responses or reconcile discrepancies that came in the symptom reports that were filed late. So the retroactive reports were incomplete, and they didn't make an adequate attempt to verify and correct those and get complete information when they could. And so I guess in this case, my question is, was this a study design issue? Was it a site training issue? Was it a subject compliance issue, which is always a problem? Or was it a study oversight issue? Or maybe all of the above, right, in a case like this. So, there were some processes and procedures in place, but they weren't followed. And there wasn't enough oversight to catch it early enough and prevent the collection of data that was incomplete. So just to recap, we recognize sponsors rely on multiple contractors to conduct global clinical trials. It's important when contracting that they set up contracts, agreements, and related plans that are well-designed and complete and to guide the trial. Sponsors are ultimately responsible. And so training and oversight are going to be key to success in that regard. Here's some resources for you, and we're going to take questions at the end of the day. So, thank you. Turn it over next to my colleague, Jason.
You're right, it does make an awful noise. So I'm going to talk a little bit about risk proportionate sponsor oversight, following on from Barbara and Adil. And the kind of things we're going to talk a little bit about, where does the responsibilities sit for this with the regulator? Where does it sit with the sponsor? We're going to talk a little bit about how sponsor oversight has evolved. The days of writing a single trial, writing the protocol, and then sticking with that no matter what, somewhat gone a little bit. These days, trials are much more adaptive. They move on a lot more. So we'll talk a little bit about how that sort of fits then with sponsor oversight, how that sort of works. And then the next bit is to sort of discuss how risk proportionate sponsor oversight sort of works. What kind of things do you need to bear in mind when you run trials which are risk proportionate? So as everybody said, so I'll carry on from Barbara. I'll add a 13th to the list. The sponsor's responsible for the trial. Always has been, always will be. It doesn't matter what they give away, what they delegate out. If you're the sponsor, the responsibilities for that all sit with you. You are responsible for what happens on your trial. And if you're responsible for the trial, you're also responsible for how it's conducted. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're tied into a really hard, static box. There are plenty of ways of working your trial, so it's adaptive, proportionate, all those kind of things. It also fits with this idea that for a long time, there's been a real move towards regulatory acceptance of risk adaptation, risk proportionality. Certainly in the UK, we published guidance back in sort of 2012, over 10 years ago. talking about risk adaptive measures, risk proportionality, different types of trials and the risks associated with them. And then we continue to build on this. We keep talking about how do you risk adapt your trial, what's proportionate in terms of what you're trying to achieve with your trial, the kind of data you're trying to capture. Do you need the belt and braces forensic approach to data collection? Are you trying to achieve data perfection? Or are you trying to capture sort of enough that everybody's comfortable that what you're doing sort of works, sort of fits together? Historically, I think there's been quite a lot of reticence from sponsors to adapt some or adopt some of this risk proportionality. What's the regulator going to say when I turn up and say, and I didn't do this and I didn't do that and I only did a tiny little bit of this because I believed it wasn't important. So we already see it on inspection where we see often belt and braces. But in some respects, the more important bit is when you then go and submit it later on and the assessor goes, well, that's no good to me. You didn't do a thing, whatever that thing might be. And at which point you can't put it back. The trial's finished, your patients have been sort of disbanded. It's very difficult to go back to the data you have available to you and go, how can we bolt some extra bits on the side to bolster this if you haven't done it? So it's sort of the time really for sponsors to sort of accept that as regulators we've been quite comfortable with this for a while. But you need to have processes and approaches for managing it, for working out what's important, for working with it, rather than just going, no, we must do everything. We must achieve data perfection. We must achieve total rigid control over everything which happens on a trial. As regulators, we continue to push risk proportionality, and we see that across all sorts of things, and we push it more and more each year. We've talked about it for a long time. We've encouraged you to do it. You're now starting to see it appear in guidance. We're seeing it appear in ICH, and more of that in a minute. So now's the time. If you haven't already, you're starting to be pushed towards it, and at some point you're going to have to do it, whether that's little baby steps or whether that's you're going to be dragged kicking and screaming into having to achieve risk proportionality, whether you like it or not. So it's a continuing evolution, really. And so just a couple of examples in here. We've talked a lot about E6R3, and we'll probably continue to do so over the rest of the day. But also to drop in here the UK clinical trial regulation update. So we ran a consultation in there. We talked about risk proportionality. And in this, the kind of things we're looking for is we now expect risk identification by the sponsor. It's no longer a nice to have. We expect you to look through, work out what it means, what it looks like, to have active processes for identifying these things. We then expect you to think about how you mitigate against it and what's proportionate for it, what's important in your trial, what data points are important, what elements of control are important, and how you put those in. We talk a lot about quality by design. So it's thinking up front what you're going to do rather than trying to bolt quality on later. Trying to keep the wheels on the quality bus is very difficult if you haven't planned to put the axles in the first place. And then making sure that you're not giving additional burden almost across the system. So we know our investigators are so busy. They are trying to run multiple trials. They've got their normal patient populations to stay on top of. Trials are becoming more and more complex. We're adding more and more things for them to do, whether that's oversight through decentralized trials, whether that's additional electronic systems. We're asking them to manage more and more electronic systems, more and more things they no longer have sort of full control of or full understanding, and every trial is different. So what we're trying to do ultimately is to support flexibility of trials. And we saw quite a lot of this during the pandemic, without stealing some of my slides from the next presentation. What we're trying to achieve here is that you're flexible with these things. Very few trials run exactly to plan, unless they're really simple. But in reality, as sponsors, you're trying to build more and more complicated trials to achieve as much bang for your buck across the patch. How can you achieve as much data as possible? How can you draw all that lot in the hope that in the future you can chuck it all into some kind of data lake or whatever it might be, and then you'll have tools to put it back out again. But is that right for the patients? Is that right for the trial site's trying to achieve this? How do you build your trials to collect all this kind of useful information rather than just having it for having its sake? So I was sort of hunting around a little bit to go, oh, how can I nicely describe this and fit it together? But actually ICHE 6R3, much as it's still draft at the moment, still being worked on, does this really nicely. And so the next two slides are literally a cut and paste of that text. So I'll read the first bit, you can read the rest at your leisure. So clinical trial processes, measures and approaches should be implemented in a way that's proportionate to the risks to participants and to the importance of the data being collected. So there's no point putting in place huge amounts of effort for data which perhaps is supportive rather than actually associated with your prime endpoints, this kind of thing. If age isn't necessarily that important, why are you spending a huge amount of time making sure it's right? Go off and perhaps look at the things which are a little bit more relevant. Look at the risks which are there for your trial and work out how they sort of fit in all of this. We've got to look after our trial participants. Are they safe? Are we looking after their data? Are we looking after their confidentiality? How do we make sure results are reliable? What kind of things do we need to put in place? So is it enough that you push it all to the sponsor, all to the investigator, leave it all with them? It's your job. We were talking yesterday, I think, there were a couple of questions lurking in one of the sessions about access to sites. And sites perhaps saying to the monitors, well, we don't really have time for you to come. We don't want you to come on site. But remote monitoring will only do so much. But actually, remote monitoring is a nice, powerful tool. But every now and then, there are things which you almost need to be on site to go and have a look at. There are pros and cons with both approaches. The other part of the principle in this, so just working through these a little bit, is working out sort of the level of risk with the trial. So is it above and beyond the standards of sort of routine medical care? If it's above that, what else do you need to do? What other steps do you need to put in place? And then you need to manage your critical to quality factors, trying to work out what's important in that trial. And that leads us nicely on to thinking about risk adaptation and risk assessments and things in a minute. But in order to set the groundwork for that a little bit, not all trials are the same. And what we often see when we go out on inspection is almost a boilerplate approach to quality. We have a set on the shelf, and we pull it down, we put it out there, and then try and force the trial to fit into that standard approach. But that's not often the case. They don't lend themselves to that. A very risky oncology trial with all sorts of bells and whistles on top of it versus a little bit of a Me Too kind of, we do this regularly kind of trial. They're very different. They need different approaches. There's this shift in focus onto the reliability of results rather than data perfection. It's about what's important, what matters, when you come to do the analysis later on, what do you really need to be on top of? What gives you the most out of your data? And then finally, just thinking about, it's not enough just to have risk-based quality management at a trial level. You also need some of the other supporting processes within your organisation. If your organisation is risk-averse as a sponsor and isn't prepared to accept this sort of risk-based, proportionate, moving kind of approach, you're going to struggle to put in place all of those kind of steps you need for it. So there needs to be some adoption of that. So, get asked all the time about risk assessments. We've all been doing them for years, is the thing, but we keep getting asked about how to do it, what do we need to do? There was some discussion yesterday about making sure that as inspectors and regulators that we also perform these appropriately, that we are comfortable with how you do your risk assessments and so on. So they sort of line up against three things really: safety of the trial participant, the trial results themselves, and then the integrity of the data. They're sort of the three big buckets that they sit around. And then for each of those, it's working out what's appropriate in terms of those mitigations you put in place to fit with those things that you've identified as being important to your trial. Really key to all of this, we see it all the time on inspection, is that you see a nice, solid risk assessment at the beginning of the trial. When everything's lined up, real life hasn't happened yet. At the moment, at that point in time, it's a bit of a wish list, your protocol. This is how things will happen. or this is how we expect things to occur. Patients will always meet their visit windows, we'll never have any supply problems, all of our technologies will work exactly as we expect them to, there will be no wobbles along the way. We know that's not real life, but that risk assessment is all powerful. It's where we define how things fit together. But what we actually need to do is to keep coming back to them. We actively need to manage those risks that are there. And with that, as the trial starts to rumble along and you start to see that perhaps some of these visits are more difficult for participants to achieve, or perhaps one of the technologies isn't as useful as you thought it was going to be and you've identified a bit of a gap, auditing or monitoring, identify things which are a problem, trying to fit those back into the risk assessment. So they're no longer a point in time, they have to be adaptive. You have to keep coming back to it, it needs to be a living document. You also need to look at the mitigations you've put in place, because again, when you put them in place at the beginning, it's in this ideal world kind of idea. It's, of course it will work. Here's my mitigation, it's amazing. I've put in place a check, whatever it might be. But what it isn't is it's not baptized in the fire of real life at that point in time. You know, will it stand the test of being pushed out to the investigators to do, or the monitors to collect something, or a system to be able to show you your nice green boxes in your dashboard? So you need to look at whether or not they're suitable, you need to look at whether or not they're effective. If you don't have effective risk control strategies, then again, it's a, how do you know it's doing what you think it's doing? Or are you just collecting some other piece of data which doesn't actually show you that it's doing what it's meant to be doing? And then finally, can you document it? What is it actually doing? Or is it just a thing which happens in the background? Are you actively assessing it? So your risk management needs to be ongoing, definitely not point in time. And these are some things to think about with all of that. So at the beginning, you've got sort of the nature of the trial. Is it a pivotal trial? Is it a supportive, an additional trial? Do you need to put different kind of resourcing into that? How complex is the design? And certainly Adil was talking earlier on about different types of trial design. What about the IMP? Is it simple to use? Have you done different things with it? Does it need a whole load of manipulation? And all of these add complexity. Same with trial endpoints, same with the various interventions. What are you actually doing to that poor participant that's on your trial? Do things stack up so they have an easy journey through their participation in the trial? How does it all work in terms of the experience? And I sort of hate the term, but it's quite true. You know, what's the sponsor experience look like? What's the service provider experience look like? What does the investigator experience look like? And certainly post-pandemic, we know that the investigator experience has changed. You know, once upon a while, the monitor would come on site, they would do lots of checks, they would run around, but in essence, you dump them in a room full of paper or maybe a computer and let them get on with it. This experience has changed now because actually they ask for access to their electronic health records and maybe a Zoom call or whatever it might be. And so it's now been pushed onto the site to sort of manage that a little bit more rather than the monitor. Complexity. Trials are more and more complex. More and more vendors, more and more technologies, more and more interactions between things. Things have to happen in a particular order, so the sequencing becomes more important. And then particularly with that sort of information flow as it pushes around the system, as it's driven by System A talks to System B, which triggers IMP over here and maybe a particular visit or a scheduling of a scan or something or other. And also location-wise, very few trials now just occur in a single location. You know, and certainly the minute you start dropping vendors into that, you've got vendors all over the world doing different bits and pieces. So they've become more and more complex. How do you stay on top of all of that? And certainly for a sponsor, how do you retain enough oversight, control, knowledge of all these millions of moving parts, with everybody with their own different bits of quality system, their own understanding of how things happen, their own interpretation of what they think the trial is? So that brings me a little bit to what do you need as a sponsor? What's the expectations for the kind of systems you need? Well, in essence, your quality system needs to enshrine risk proportionate approaches. So when you look through your SOPs, when you look through your quality documents, does it explain what they are? Or the kind of things which a project manager or a monitor or a project delivery specialist, whatever, that they can pull from a toolbox? Or does it just have one approach? And then it's covered somewhere else, or it's a departure from your established processes. So do your SOPs talk about it? Are your audits adaptive? Again, when you're sending your auditors out, are they looking about what's important when they're being tasked? Go and look at the important things on the trial rather than going to try and pick every aspect of the trial to ensure that perfection of data. What about training for staff? Do you train them to be comfortable with taking appropriate risk proportionate decisions, and supporting them when they make those decisions? Because if you don't, then you're sort of lining them up to fail a little bit, because you're not going to make some leap in the dark if you don't think your organisation has got you. So and with that, there's a real need for management support. If management aren't bought into, we're going to adopt risk proportionality, we're going to adopt risk adaptation into how we conduct our clinical trials and how we manage them, then nobody's ever going to do it. They're not going to take the leap in the dark. They're going to stick with safe. We must do 100% SDV, we must do 100% of this. Our audits will always check the following things, regardless of whether it's important or not. Then brings you to the trial itself. So what's your oversight strategy? All these things listed on the slide, they're all things you know and love. Plans, charters, strategies, all those kind of things. They're all known entities to you. But actually, do you define risk adaptation? Do you define risk mitigation? Do you define various approaches you could use depending on what happens in them? Or are they a little bit built in time when everything is perfect? It's important to think about all of these, and certainly on inspection, we look through them to see, one, what latitude you give yourselves within it, but equally how you live and learn with them. If this happens, what are we going to do? How do we work within it? It's important to have this ongoing risk review. So I mentioned at the beginning, your risk assessment at the beginning is one thing, but trials change. Real life happens. The minute you push it out into the real world, the minute you start getting trial participants through the door, things change. And we often see this lack of ongoing risk review. So see the risk assessment at the beginning, but it then doesn't keep track with real life. So we often see where a protocol amendment happens, but there's no revision of the risk assessment. But by this point, you've changed all sorts of things, added another arm or added in some extra tests, dropped a whole load of stuff, whatever it might be. Same with supporting processes, same with vendors, same with different solutions and things. Somebody brings out a new whizzy piece of technology and that'd be awesome, we'll use that in our trial. But it then doesn't fall into the risk assessment because it wasn't done at the beginning. And we often see those changes happen in the trial, but the risk assessments, the risk mitigations don't keep pace with it. So really important to see those risk assessments as a living document, and the same with the mitigations. Do they continue to be appropriate? Are they effective? Are they doing what you think they need to do? So what does it look like? As an inspector, when we're out there, what does risk proportionate effective sponsor oversight look like? So when we're talking to people, and it often comes from that, it's, do people understand what the key aspects of the trial are? Can they talk to me about what's critical to quality, what needs to happen in order to get a nice solid primary endpoint? And from that, what do the mitigations look like? What's the risk assessment say? What do the mitigations look like? How do I protect that primary endpoint? And I protect it by having these various strategies and plans and checks and balances in place. And if all of those work, then hopefully my data should be solid. And then you can go off and use it for supporting your marketing authorization application or whatever else you're going to do with it. And then how does the rest of it fit together with all the millions of moving parts and contractors and specialist systems and all those kind of things? How do they fit? How does data move around the system? And again, what's important from all of that? So we're looking for people to be able to talk through that, because it's easy if you live it, but it's very difficult to pull it together if you don't. And ultimately, can you relate it back to participant safety and the reliability of the data? Because if you can't, then there's a bit of an issue there. That's where it needs to come back to. If you're doing it just because, then is it effective? Is it doing what you expect it to do? Mentioned some of these already. Risk review, do you document it? Is it something which just happens in meetings but actually never gets written down anywhere? Do you document your decision making? And that's often the hardest bit for us, that something happens and you go, well, why did you decide to do that? Oh, well, we just did. Why? Where does it say that? Who sat down in a meeting and decided that actually this was an effective course of action, that this was the way you were going to go? And what does that mean? And if you've got that kind of stuff documented, then it's a little bit easier for us as inspectors when we turn up on site to see what you were thinking at the time. And worst case is all the people that made those decisions have now left. And you're the poor soul holding the TMF at that point in time going, I've no idea why my colleagues did this, but that's just what they decided to do. Ultimately, we look for staff to be empowered to adopt risk proportionality and empowered to act. If you see a problem, go and do something about it. So in summary, it's important to understand the purpose of the trial. It's important to understand how the conduct of the trial is going to happen, how you plan it, and then actually being able to react to real life. It's important that all of you promote flexibility in your trial designs and flexibility in the conduct of your trial. And then with risk assessments, I've put here, get into the detail, but don't go mad. But you need to understand that your trials are complex. So don't just do, only going to do the IMP. Think about how it fits together. Think about what's important for your trial and make sure those risk assessments are ongoing. My closing thought for you is in some respects, it's very much time for your sponsors to adopt risk proportionality. You have support from the regulators to do this. There's guidance out there. If you need more examples, you need more support, ask for it. We are looking to support the adoption of risk proportionality. And in some respects, we're a little bit in your hands too, in terms of what you need. So more than happy to catch up with people later on. If you think there are obvious things missing, by all means, come talk to me, and I'll add them to my list. That leaves me very much to thank Barbara, to thank Adil. Thank you all for your time and attention this morning. It's now time for a break, so that's 20 minutes, which brings us to 10 past 10. So thank you very much.
All righty, welcome back everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We are about 14 seconds behind schedule. So let's get settled and get ready to welcome our next session panelists to the stage. Thank you again, everyone, for getting back in such a timely manner. This is session 2, Clinical Trials Post-Pandemic, Positive Disruption to Establish Ways of Working. And I would like to welcome to the stage Aram Hassan, Lieutenant Commander in the Office of Scientific Investigations, and her panelists. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I'm Lieutenant Commander Aram Hassan. So this session will discuss changes in the conduct of clinical activities and inspection activities post-pandemic and the adoption of regulatory flexibilities. So we're gonna explore insights gained from post-pandemic inspections conducted from all of our international regulatory agencies, FDA, MHRA, and Health Canada. So I have the privilege to introduce our speakers for this session. So first we'll have Jason Wakilan-Smith speaking. He's an expert GCP inspector and head of compliance expert circle for MHRA. Jason has been with MHRA since 2006. Next, we're going to have Jennifer Evans. She's a compliance specialist for Health Canada. She has over a decade of industry experience prior to joining Health Canada in 2012. And last but not least, we'll have Richard Burning, who has served as an FDA investigator for over 13 years. Mr. Burning is currently on the OBIMO International Inspection Cadre, and he's conducted international inspections in more than 20 countries. All of these speakers have extensive experience in GCP inspections covering clinical investigators, sponsors, CROs, bioequivalence studies. So I encourage you all to read more about them on their speaker bios, which are posted online. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jason.
So first of all, thanks for the opportunity to speak again. I'm in essence just going to set the scene a little bit, really, and then I'll pass it over to my colleagues. As we all know, the pandemic forced all of us to make significant changes to the way that we worked and our practices, whether that's as a regulator, whether that's as a sponsor, whether as a CRO, whatever. Life changed dramatically. Things like regulatory flexes, which I'll come on to in a little bit, appeared, and we all changed how we worked. But the purpose of this sort of session is to talk a little bit about what have we learnt, and what have we pulled out of this. And what have we retained going forward? So I'm going to talk a little bit about regulatory flexes. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we were forced to change our ways of working, and a little bit about our sort of pandemic activities and how that can be sort of carried over into where we are today. So March 2020, the world ground to a halt, as I'm sure you're all aware. Restrictions were imposed as the pandemic swept the globe. And suddenly our own little worlds changed overnight. You know, as an inspector, we were out and about. I just got my Chinese visa for a trip overseas. We were all ready, and then overnight you are grounded, you are going nowhere. Suddenly my wife had me at home quite a lot more than before, and I was constantly getting underfoot and therefore being given plenty of jobs to do. But things changed. You know, the kids were at home. And we're doing homeschooling, you know, the rise of Zoom and Teams and Skype and all of those kind of things. You know, we all had them. We were, you know, my parents were busy working out how to use their iPads. They could actually talk to us and this kind of thing. So life fundamentally changed. But in terms of visits, you know, hospitals are, if you just ever stand and watch the entrance to a hospital, you just watch swathes of people wandering in and out all day long. And suddenly there were no-go areas. You know, do you have COVID? Yes. You may end up at the hospital. If you don't have COVID, don't go near the hospital. And great swathes of the medical community were focused on or refocused on the provision of COVID care. You just look at who was dragged back into doing that kind of thing. But what did it mean for clinical trials? In essence, the nature of the pandemic and the need for social distancing meant that overnight things had to change. Prior to that, your investigator would see the patients, they'd go into the hospital, they were fundamentally linked with the trial site. Decentralised trials weren't really a thing, really. There were a few sort of attempts at it, but they were not common by any stretch. But the need to keep patients away from the hospital meant that lots of changes had to happen. You know, you had the fear of infection, trying to protect the clinicians that were there, trying to keep patients clear of COVID, all of that kind of thing. And then you had the refocusing of what trials were ongoing, what trials could continue to happen, but equally what needed to happen in order to support trying to get rid of COVID. So it was identified really early on that there was a real need for guidance to support sponsors as the world started locking down and people were looking at what can we do and how are we going to keep these things running. And so across the globe, guidance started to appear. So on the slide, you can see MHRA-FDA, Health Canada's regulatory flexes, which started to appear. And the purpose of this was really to support the efforts of those people conducting trials. So how can you keep your trial running as long as possible? Or to help you either suspend it, close it down. Certainly in the UK, there was a look at trials, whether or not where they were, whether they were likely to ever meet their expected outcomes and things. So some trials were just closed, others were mothballed, as well as trying to work with how might we run trials again in the future? You know, how might we run trials supporting COVID products? So just to give some examples, had all sorts of trial adaptations, so things like you could go ahead and change the visit schedule. You know, once upon a while, I'd see you every month. You know, come to my clinic, we'll measure some things, we'll talk about how you are, that kind of stuff. Now it was, I don't want to see you. And we're going to get rid of a whole load of these things that require you to come to the hospital. And perhaps there's other ways we can keep some of that ticking along. Remote visits became a thing. And much more than before, you know, often you'd get your research nurse perhaps ring the patient home. How you doing? You all right? You still with us? Anything you need to tell us? That was almost the extent of your remote visit. But suddenly they became a real thing. You know, more and more discussions happened about what could be done at home. And you know, just looking on LinkedIn yesterday, there was a colleague from FDA talking about, you know, the potential for a trial in a box. which could be sent to a patient, and these kind of things. So they're really interesting thinking which has come from this. Informed consent, you know, we talked about e-consent before, I'll come back to that in a minute. IMP being shipped to patients' home or participants' homes directly. You know, I worked in hospital pharmacy before I became an inspector, and we used to send stuff to patients at home, mainly because they didn't want to stay and wait for the couple of hours it was going to take us to actually ship medication or to dispense their medication. We did it reluctantly, but we'd been doing it for years. All this was in essence, turning this into more of an established process. Same with safety reporting, do the best you can with what you have available, but we still need to know what's going on. Remote monitoring became much more of a thing. And then, in inverted commas, the acknowledgement of protocol deviations. Real life continues to happen. So do the best you can, and then we'll work with you with that. But what's quite interesting is that, in essence, there were plenty of prior enablers. So certainly in the UK, the legislation is broad. You know, it's very much high principle stuff. It doesn't say thou shalt do a thing, or at least generally it doesn't. It's pretty broad about how you conduct or can conduct a clinical trial, and that's deliberate because it enables all types of trials to happen, whether it's phase 1, first in man, all the way through to phase 4, and allowing all of those different types of work to occur. You know, we've always been, MHRA has always been a pragmatic regulator, and our, like I said, regulations are generally high level, supported by detailed guidance, and that's where that comes from. So there's always been the ability, and I mentioned it in my previous talk, the ability to flex a little bit, to put in risk proportionality, risk adaptation. So that's always been there. The pandemic just forced people to have to adopt some of it because they had to continue to get their trials to work. In the UK, there was some previous pandemic legislation. Well, you know, 2009 avian flu, if anybody remembers that. There were a few bits and pieces that were bolted onto the legislation, not very much. If you look at it, it's a couple of sides of paper, changing a few bits and pieces, but mainly about labelling, a little bit about timelines for things like urgent safety measures and things. But people have started thinking about it. Some capacity existed within the system. And then, in some respects, this brings me probably to the biggest point of all in my presentation, is that times have changed in terms of technology, and we have all of these things available to us now, and they're much more established. Very, very few trials now run without any e-systems. You know, whether that's IRT, whether that's eCRF, eCOA, all those kind of things. There are so many e-systems out there now which allow alternative ways of working to occur. You know, e-consent, you know, we're busy talking about e-consent. In 2018, we published some guidance along with National Research Ethics Service in the UK about e-consent, but people just weren't picking up particularly quickly on using it. It's difficult. We don't know how it's going to come across. We don't know what it looks like. I don't know how to really put that in. And then suddenly you're in this world of, I've got to put it in because there's no other way of doing this. And so the pandemic became a crucible, really, of trial by fire, of you've got to get these things to work. It doesn't matter what it looks like. It doesn't matter how you're going to do it. You've got to adopt it and get on with it, or not run trials. So the next couple of slides really help set the scene a little bit, really. The clinical trial landscape was already, in some respects, in quite a good place. There was quite a lot of supported stuff sitting within it, but what it didn't have was the impetus to use a lot of it. But the pandemic required us to sort of get on and adopt a lot of these things, targeted trials. You know, suddenly you can't collect everything just because your patient's there. You've got to make trials as simple as possible. And I'm not saying that the pandemic trials themselves were simple. Some of them were incredibly complicated, but you had to really think about what you were collecting and how you were going to collect it. You needed to think about risk adaptation a lot more. How can we do as much as we can within the constraints we have, whilst making it deliverable by the trial teams, whilst making it simple for patients or participants to do their thing, and to have them as broad as possible. We need as many patients as we can get into the vaccine studies, all those kind of things. It forced the researchers to sort of adopt new ways of working, to think about alternative ways of working. You can't just have the participant rock up to clinic and then stab them for blood, measure a bunch of things, get them to fill in some questionnaires and send them on their way again. Suddenly you've got to be able to do all that lot in an alternative kind of way. And in some respects, it's stress tested some trial components. You know, there's been all sorts of things which have been in the regs for ages. You know, so assent by a legal guardian, been in the regs for ages. always been in there pretty much, but very few trials actually use it, whereas suddenly you're confronted by a patient population which you have to use this for. So how are you as an organisation going to manage it from a sponsor point of view, or as a trial site use it? Another interesting point is that it massively increased awareness of clinical trials. Suddenly my mum knew what I did and was able to talk about phases of a clinical trial. My children were talking about what was coming through from the vaccines and which ones they'd like, much as they thought they had a choice. But anyway, it was just a bit weird. But you suddenly had all this patient interest and involvement in clinical trials, which we don't routinely see. And that's something to make sure we continue to tap into, that patient awareness of what's going on. The general population is given this background knowledge. Certainly in the UK, you had the chief medical officers standing up talking about trials and putting up graphs of things and whatever. And that working knowledge, the newspapers were full of clinical trial information and how trials work and this kind of thing. So hopefully that's whetted people's appetite for the future of getting involved in more clinical trials. It also forced sponsors to adapt and evolve. In the toolbox had often been consent and these kind of things, but they were very much that. They were at the back of the box, maybe back of the shelf, something for another day maybe is complicated, don't really have the time, don't really have the experience, not sure how a regulator's going to accept it, no idea how we might defend it on inspection, those kind of things. But suddenly you're forced to get them off the shelf and get on with it. And then work out how to use it effectively. And over time, people got better at it. But certainly out on inspection, looking at some of these things, some things worked well, other things didn't work so well. And e-consent or remote consent is a great example of that. For a lot of people, it worked well. They built systems to work with it. Others struggled a bit more with it. And certainly one of the sites we went to was a general practitioner, and we were listening to some phone calls made by a patient who was to be involved in a clinical trial. And listening to the conversation is real life. And the patient wanted to know one thing, the doctor wanted to tick some things off the list, but how the two were actually two very different conversations all meant to be about the same thing was really interesting. I think finally on this slide is to think about how, as a regulator, how we then work with applicants. And we see this sort of working through the system now. We did quite a lot of work with potential applicants for the future, so the sponsors of the time, support their setup and running of the COVID trials. Lots of scientific advice, lots of stage gating, submit the data you've got, let's see how we go. And that's provided much food for thought about future ways of working and sort of collaboration. How might we be able to do that in the future? Is that something we can build into some aspect of business as usual? But post-pandemic, you can't have all of these things running forever. And some of these needed to be tightened back up again. They were put in place to allow for a particular point in time. So some things were tightened back up again. Urgent safety measure reporting dropped back to its usual reporting timelines. Same with things like development safety update reports, again, were required within a time frame rather than just being when you can achieve it. But what we then started to see was this healthy growth in alternative ways of working as people worked through these things and went, decentralized trials, we can do that, virtual trials, all these different types of innovative trial designs, buckets, baskets, umbrellas, all these new terms which suddenly we had to come to terms with. We used at the beginning trial by fire, people worked through it and worked out what they were going to do with it. And now we start to see them in the common terminology we're discussing today. I suspect a good chunk of people in the room and certainly online now have some experience of these things, because they're no longer just an academic publication describing this is one alternative approach to running a clinical trial. You've probably either looked at it or have trials of your own which run using these alternative methods. Like I said, it brings us to alternative ways of working, so things like rolling review and this kind of thing, but also trying to push you to continue that sort of innovation. How else can you run clinical trials? What else can you do to make the participant journey as easy as possible, the investigator's journey as easy as possible, to streamline the data you capture to make sure you have what's important rather than just collecting everything in sight just because you can. And with that then brings good quality trials, good quality data collection, and useful tools and approaches for people to use. As I mentioned in my previous talk, E6R3 has taken on board some of these ideas and processes and dropped them in as well, and trying to provide useful guidance. And along the way, we all now have a little bit more working knowledge of them. So we bring our pandemic learning and experience to these things. So to summarise a little bit, many of the processes and approaches already existed. They were just sitting on the shelf waiting to be used, or for organisations to develop their experience of using them, and in some respects the courage to dust them off and give them a go. It massively forced everyone to evolve their processes and to look at alternative ways of doing things. And that feeds into risk-based trial design, that feeds into risk-based trial conduct, and also the further expansion of alternative ways of working. Just a few things to go and read, just some of the things I've mentioned along the way. And then my closing thought before I pass it on is that ultimately we all need to ensure that we've learned from our COVID-19 trial experiences and that we've evolved our practice and conduct by the development of innovative, effective and risk proportionate clinical trials. I just think it's so important that we use what we've learned, that it doesn't just go, times were different back then, it was a bit weird, a bit stressful, a bit different, but we're going to stop all of that lot and we're going to go back to the trials of yesteryear. I don't think that's the way forward. So I'd like to pass you now on to Jennifer, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for that, Jason. Now we'll be doing the session topic from the Canadian point of view. So just an overview, talking about inspection changes during the pandemic, again, from the Canadian point of view. We'll introduce you to what's called compliance readiness inspections, or CRIs for short. And then we'll discuss some inspection changes post-pandemic, again, from the Canadian point of view. And we'll wrap it up with some real-world examples of CRIs via some case studies. So the Clinical Trial Compliance Program is a national coast-to-coast program, with our mandate being to promote and verify compliance of drug clinical trials against the Food and Drugs Act and associated regulations, including Part C, Division 5 of the Food and Drug Regulations, as well as good clinical practice. And how do we do this? We conduct inspections of the regulated parties conducting clinical trials. We develop guidance documents for the public to use to help with clinical trials, as well as compliance promotion, such as speaking today at today's symposium. So some inspection changes from the Canadian point of view during the pandemic. When it started, we halted all our on-site inspections, but we still wanted to ensure that the regulated parties were compliant with GCP and the clinical trial regulations. So we switched things up and we went remote as well as hybrid if an on-site portion was warranted. There was lots of players in the game. Everyone was kind of all hands on deck to solve the COVID-19 problem. So there was a lot of new stakeholders conducting clinical trials. And we also introduced new temporary regulatory measures called the interim order. We developed that as a regulatory flexibility. The first one in the spring of 2020, which was renewed with interim order number 2 in the spring of 2021. And we also developed remote compliance readiness inspections. We started them, and the first one being done in the fall of 2020. So a lot of things were happening in the first few months of the pandemic. Not too shabby considering the government historical speed with which they conduct new processes. So what are these compliance readiness inspections that we're talking about? As mentioned, they were a new inspection developed during the pandemic. Their purpose being to wanting to conduct them prior to participant enrollment. So no data was being reviewed with these types of inspections. We want to verify the site or the organization is actually ready to enroll and dose the participants. We want to ensure the sponsors and the sites that are conducting COVID-19 clinical trials are better prepared to meet GCP and Canadian regulatory requirements before they actually full on start their clinical trial, with the goal being to reduce non-compliances during the clinical trial. So the methodology we use for CRIs, we are focused on compliance readiness targeting human drug clinical trials, and this was in Canada. They were mostly done remotely in the beginning, did have the on-site or hybrid option if warranted. And the regulated parties we looked to inspect were the same ones that we were inspecting prior to the pandemic: sponsors, CROs, and qualified investigators, or PIs, as you call them in other jurisdictions, especially if it was a sponsor QI, as our regulations do not differentiate between commercial and non-commercial sponsors. And it's not, CRI is not really a quote, quote, full inspection. It's a shorter one, over 2 to 3 days, and 1 or 2 inspectors, as compared to a sponsor inspection, which is a systems-based inspection. You can have that anywhere from 5 to 10 days, and with 2 or 3 sponsors. 2 or 3 inspectors, sorry. There's 3 main stages of the CRI. You've got the pre-inspection stage, where you open the inspection, you're getting prepared. Then you have the inspection itself, starts with an opening meeting. Then you can conduct it remotely, on-site or hybrid options. Then you follow it at the end with a closing meeting. And then post-inspection, you're just closing out the inspection. So I'll go into a bit more details of those stages right now. So as mentioned, the pre-inspection stage, the inspector will select the regulated party and the study they are going to inspect. This is from an internal list of recommended studies. It's risk-based. Then they will contact the inspected party. They will introduce the CRI. They will ask questions about the stage of the clinical trial, the status of it. Just as mentioned, we'd like to have it before participants are enrolled. Not that we can't do a CRI if they have, but if they're near the end of the clinical trial, it wouldn't be as effective. Then they will kind of set tentative dates with the inspected party. And then once those dates are confirmed, the inspector will send a written notification letter and a CRI checklist. Go into a bit more detail about the checklist in the next slide. And then the inspector will do their preparation. They'll obtain information about the study from the Health Canada records, looking at the clinical trial application, reviewing the protocol and amendments, any sort of informed consent documentation, study drug information, what have you. And then the inspector will prepare their inspection plan. And we also do a presentation during the compliance readiness inspection, kind of introducing Health Canada, the regulations, and the notice that went out during the pandemic about management of clinical trials. We discussed that. So what is on a typical inspection plan? The checklist for a CRI. Now, this is areas that an inspector may focus. It's by no means an exhaustive list. It's not in any order of priority. It's just giving some examples. So as mentioned, we'll look at the status of the clinical trial, look for key dates. When did you get your ethics review approval? Did you do SIVs yet? When was your first dosing, if that has happened? How many sites are going to be involved, number of participants, et cetera. We'll also want to have a look at the organizational charts. Who are the key players? What are their responsibilities? A lot of review of the clinical trial procedures and plans, looking at key SOPs such as informed consent process, drug management. You'll have monitoring SOPs if you're involved with equipment and the maintenance and calibration of that. Training being another key one, how you're managing and reporting adverse events and so on, and record retention procedures. Monitoring plans would be one thing we'd want to review, various safety management plans, data management, IP management, risk management, et cetera plans. We'd be looking at the protocol and informed consent form and the investigator's brochure, see how they compare to what we have in our records to the current version that's being used in the trial. Looking at training records, and this can be very encompassing in that you're looking at the monitor's qualifications, CVs of study personnel, job descriptions, their training records in regards to study-specific training, GCP training, and in our case, Division 5 for the Canadian regulations. And in the interim order training, if they were conducting it during the pandemic under that pathway, as well as looking at if they've conducted an SIV documentation there, et cetera. Contracts and agreements between the sponsor and the investigator or an institution. If there's third parties involved, what are the delegated responsibilities there? And the investigational product label will also be reviewed because in Canada, we need it in both English and French. And then electronic systems, which ones are going to be used with this study? A list of them, what's their status? Have they been validated for their intended use and so on? So during the CRI itself, there'll be the opening meeting, introductions, explaining the purpose and scope of the inspection, explaining the inspector's authority to conduct the inspection, giving that presentation that I mentioned, and then the inspector will make their document requests accordingly. Then they'll get down to doing review of all those clinical trial documents they've requested. They may conduct interviews with key personnel if they need some further information and questions answered. And if there's any additional requests as a result of the initial review and interviews, that will be done during the inspection as well. And then at the end, the information will be consolidated and the findings that the inspector had during the course of the inspection will be summarized, and it's done verbally. And this is because there is no written inspection report that's issued from this type of inspection. There's no actually overall compliance rating for the inspection and no individual risk ratings for the findings. And as a result of the no inspection report, there's also no corrective and preventative action required to be submitted to Health Canada by the inspected party. And then post-inspection, within a few days of the inspection, the inspector will send a completion letter, written, usually sent via email. Then they will compile all the information from the inspection, summarize it in an internal database. This would be all the key dates, the documents that were sent to the inspected party, the various letters. If they've retained any documents from the inspection to support their findings, that will be saved and collected as well. And making notes about the status of the study, obviously all their findings from the study. And we'll save those relevant documents in our Health Canada repository. And as mentioned, there is no inspection report issued. And there's also no posting on the Health Canada website. Our other investigator inspections are publicly posted for you to review, but the CRI inspections are not. If there is any significant findings from the CRI, the place to note it is in this inspector summary, and they can then also recommend that a regular inspection be conducted in the future. So just some summaries of the CRIs. As mentioned, they were started during the pandemic, and it's to ensure the regulated party is better prepared to meet GCP and Canadian regulatory requirements. And we're targeting to do it before they've actively gone and conducted the clinical trial, because we want to reduce the likelihood of non-compliances during the inspection and protect the safety and rights of the participants, as well as generating valid clinical trial data. We have since expanded from initially doing only COVID clinical trials to doing other areas which we're seeing emerging non-compliance. And we're also doing CRIs with new sponsors and qualified investigators, because they seem to be a higher risk for non-compliances because of their not as familiar with the regulations. So some inspection changes from the Canadian point of view post-pandemic. We've gone back to on-site inspections, but we are still continuing with remote and hybrid inspections. So we've got that inspection flexibility continuing. And we're continuing and expanding areas for new inspection options, bioequivalence inspections, medical device inspections, what have you. And the Canadian regulatory regulations are providing an alternative pathway. The interim order was changed into the COVID regulations, the clinical trials for medical devices and drugs relating to COVID-19 regulations, which came into effect in February 2022. This is continuing to facilitate the authorization and implementation of COVID-19 related clinical trials and maintains the flexibilities that were set out in the interim order until the framework framework with the Clinical Trials Modernization Initiative is in place. And we're continuing our compliance readiness inspections post-pandemic. So now to get into some real-world examples from CRI inspections. These are actual regulated parties who were inspected, but no specific names or studies will be identified to protect the innocent or guilty. They're representatives of findings from our CRIs. We saw some kind of trends of common themes of findings. So case study A, the sponsor was new to clinical trials and not previously inspected by Health Canada. So that's one of our risk factors. They were conducting a COVID-related clinical trial. We conducted this CRI remotely during the pandemic. And as it turns out, we also did a regular sponsor inspection with this sponsor on site post-pandemic. It wasn't as a result of a recommendation from the CRI, it was just part of our regular inspection process. So we have kind of findings from both the CRI and the sponsor inspection to provide there. So some findings from the CRI. Their SOPs, plans, and other documents were mostly in place, so good on them. But they did have some miscellaneous issues with procedures, version controls, approvals, and they were missing some elements such as remote monitoring, which a lot of sponsors had to add a lot of remote elements, remote informed consent, as was previously mentioned, as well as remote monitoring. They had some document quality issues, drug accountability, delegation log, training records, etc. And they had no study team training on the Canadian regulations as it related to the interim order, which is what they were operating under, and the pharmacy manual. So as compared to some findings we found during the sponsor inspection, they had a CRO involved remotely, and we did have some deficiencies in some various areas with systems and procedures, the documents and safety data reviews as an example, the clinical trial plans, examples of monitoring and safety management, and the associated documentation had some deficiencies there, as well as the electronic system access and traceability had some deficiencies, and the training records and the training and associated records there also had some deficiencies. But overall, they had no critical observations. We don't overall rate our sponsor inspections, we just rate the observations and findings themselves. As mentioned, they had no critical ones. As compared to case study B, there's some similarities in the fact that they were new sponsor QI to clinical trials. We'd not previously inspected them. They were also conducting a COVID-related clinical trial. We didn't actually conduct a CRI on them. We found out about this sponsor and the issues from an internal referral, and a compliance verification was done at the end of the study. And so it was kind of a retrospective analysis of the issues. And the issues that we found with them is they were implementing protocol amendments without Health Canada approval, submitting notifications to Health Canada not within the regulatory timelines, and they had multiple other deficiencies under the Canadian regulations in various aspects: systems and procedures, training, protocol deviations, monitoring, investigator oversight, records management, to name a few. So in hindsight, this is a good example of a sponsor that may have benefited from a CRI. So they might have not had these issues during their clinical trial. Case study C is similar to the other two in that it was, again, a new sponsor QI to clinical trials. We'd not previously inspected them, but they were conducting a non-COVID clinical trial. It was an area of emerging concern. We also did this CRI remotely. It was just done post-pandemic. So some of the findings from that inspection: several documents, the SOPs, plans, etc., were not yet finalized or approved. They were missing many aspects there. The personnel had not all been selected or delegated properly, or any contracts in place. They had no ICH, GCP, or Canadian regulations training. And study drug documents were unclear or wrong or missing information. they were approved to conduct clinical trials. They'd gotten their no objection letter from Health Canada. So technically you should be ready and good to go. But as the CRI found out, they had several things that needed to be done before they could conduct a clinical trial without the potential for having lots of non-compliances. So we actually recommended for future inspection with this sponsor. So some takeaways from the case studies. We are finding non-compliances. But we're also finding that there's a learning experience for the regulated party. It's identifying improvements to make. The CRIs are not like a finger wagging type inspection. They're there to help ensure that the regulated party is better prepared to conduct the clinical trial and meet the GCP and regulatory requirements during the active or busy phase of the trial. We're also noticing that the lack of regulatory knowledge and clinical trial preparation can indeed lead to more observations and more major or critical observations. So thereby you have an increased likelihood of non-compliance, which can then lead to a risk to participant safety and data integrity. So to summarize overall from the Canadian perspective, our inspection strategy is more flexible in that we've got remote and hybrid inspections that we're conducting in addition to our traditional on-site inspections. And the compliance readiness inspection is a flexible option in our compliance toolbox in that it's providing more clinical trial guidance upstream to hopefully therefore reduce non-compliances and issues downstream while still looking to protect the participants' rights and safety and ensure valid clinical trial data. We also noticed that electronic documentation and systems are more commonplace from the paper way, from both the Health Canada and the regulated party perspective, which we're finding easier, faster, more efficient communication and document sharing and record retention aspects. So if you have any questions about that or the session, please provide them to the Q&A panel at the end of today. So thank you very much, and I'll now pass it over to Richard for the FDA perspective for this session.
Sorry. Thank you, Jennifer and Jason. Let's click it forward. All right. So I'm Rick Burning. Nice to meet you all. As Iram said in her introduction to me, I sit in the Office of Bioresearch Monitoring Operations within ORA. And just for the international attendees who might not be familiar with that function, ORA is kind of our boots on the grounds. We do the on-site inspections. And within OBIMO, I monitor international inspection cadre. So I'm dedicated to doing mostly international inspections. So I'm going to do this summary of pre and post COVID inspection activities from my personal perspective, the boots on the ground. All right, so we'll go through a brief overview of the development and implementation of remote regulatory assessments during the pandemic, and then move on to my boots on the ground perspective on what typical inspections have looked like pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. And the typical disclaimer, these are my personal perspectives and opinions on the matter and not representative of FDA. All right, so we've talked a little bit about these remote regulatory assessments, or RAs, and we will continue to talk about them in future presentations, so I will not dwell on the topic for too long. But for my participation, these are one of the biggest innovations for FDA during the pandemic from an OBIMO standpoint, because inspections were not possible at the time. And they're a useful, if somewhat limited tool. They're still being adapted for continued use in the post-pandemic era. By design, they were not intended to create an undue burden on inspection sites, on the study sites, as many international clinical investigator sites simply are not equipped to facilitate the types of things like scanning an entire study's worth of documentation to submit electronically to then talk about on video conferences. So due to this, we had to be very thoughtful about exactly what we wanted to look at during these focused reviews. And we had to make sure that we scheduled times for interviews that were compatible with the global facilities and that they would be able to talk via interpreter usually as the documentation that we wanted to know. This was a lot of late nights and early mornings. These are better than nothing, but they don't afford such an in-depth review as an inspection. Right, and just like everybody else, FDA had to develop policies and procedures in real time during the pandemic, and bioresearch monitoring, even within FDA, had different needs in other areas. Many of the different arms of FDA utilize these RRAs, and they were trying to figure out if they were a good fit, even the CIFSAN and CDRH, everybody else. I know CEDAR and BIMO, we definitely went fully on board with these during the pandemic. And we're still continuing to adapt it. Recently, in October 2023, FDA issued a new draft guidance for industry that discusses RAs by a new moniker of remote interactive evaluations, or RAEs. This will be covered in further presentations. So I'll move on to my particular focus, which is the investigator perspective. I'll go through an overview of what typical inspections consisted of pre-pandemic and how innovations such as decentralized trial structures and implementation of digital health technologies have changed these inspections post-COVID. So pre-pandemic, reason, highly centralized. Data usually created, kept at investigator sites, and the subjects typically seen exclusively at a study site. These are the classic study types that most of us have been familiar with over the years. At the investigator site level or clinical bioequivalence inspection level, you will find that the vast majority of study data is generated locally. Exceptions to that may be IVRS or central lab evaluations. This is a potentially burdensome setup for the study sites from a data collection standpoint, and potentially burdensome to study subjects by virtue of the required travel distance and just the frequency of coming to the study site for visit after visit after visit. And so by that nature, it can reduce the potential number of subjects that may be able to access and participate in the trial. But from my perspective, I used to like those. Be fairly efficient inspection study sites. You could just show up, walk in the door. You know that pretty much everything you want to look at to ensure the review is adequate is at the site. And as we've talked about during these other presentations, post-pandemic, there's an increase in the decentralization of these clinical trials. And it had been on the horizon prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, but as others have stated and illustrated in the presentations, the need to continue clinical research trials had to be properly balanced while ensuring subject safety and also maintaining the quality of the research. And so there was a push to decentralize these clinical trials, and it felt like a fast forward button was pushed. And as inspections have returned to normal from late 2021 to present, more and more of the work I do involves a trial with at least one or more decentralized elements. To date, I've yet to fully encounter a fully decentralized trial. The hybrid model seems to be the preferred one based on my particular experience. So FDA published numerous updates to the COVID-19 clinical trials conduct guidance during the pandemic. This is to aid sponsors in minimizing disruption to clinical trials. Ideas such as the remote informed consent, remote telehealth visits, remote monitoring, home healthcare evaluations, and remote data capture via digital health technologies that began to enter the mainstream as there were practical applications of the need to protect the health of study subjects and continue research activities. And the flexibility that was afforded to industry and researchers during the pandemic further to shift into the decentralized clinical trials. And in my view, it won't return to the pre-pandemic structures. And once this flexibility was used to demonstrate that the changes in research design and conduct could be effective and reliable, a return to the old paradigm seems improbable. And FDA has continued to develop further guidance for industry as the interest in these areas continues. Just last year in 2023, we provided updated guidance documents on decentralized clinical trials, the use of real-world data and real-world evidence, and the use of digital health technologies in drug development and clinical investigations. And these were rolled out to continue to provide current agency thinking on these topics due to the increased interest and utilization of all aspects of the research that got a jumpstart during the pandemic. The decentralized approach can offer greater access to participation in clinical trial and reduce subject burdens, as previously outlined. But there are certainly some growing pains involved, as the burden can move from the subject to the study site. Some study sites I've seen have shown struggles with adapting to telehealth and remote monitoring systems, as investigators are used to maintaining greater direct control over study activities simply by virtue of them being conducted within their institutions. And while remote monitoring can be an effective tool to evaluate compliance with study activities, I've observed that it can be harder to identify site non-compliance and implement corrective actions without a personal presence at the site that is conducting a study outside of its usual scope. Think of sites where they're taking on new studies outside of their typical function areas, they have a higher enrollment population in a particular trial, or stricter blinding criteria. If monitoring isn't happening at appropriate intervals at these sites, problems can persist and multiply. Proper risk assessment is critical when implementing monitoring plans, and considerations need to be given to the site's ability to adapt to new study structures and equipment. And from my end, decentralized trials can be harder on the FDA inspection side. My overarching goal is the same on an inspection now as it was 5 years ago. I try to meet the requested level of review from the center issuing an inspection assignment memorandum to me and make sure that subject safety and rights are protected and that all the data generated from application is accurate and true to the best extent possible. In a centralized trial, I can do all that from one place when I show up. In the decentralized environment, when I arrive at the study site, I have to begin the inspection by confirming what the responsibilities at a site or a sponsor actually were for a given study or studies. And then once I establish that, I have to determine what data I can properly assess from what the inspected entity is responsible for. These days, it feels like I spend more time sifting through system audit trails, user acceptance testing, or data transfer specs, or a receipt confirmation than I do reviewing site records. And part of the difficulty for FDA in particular is that unlike some of our regulatory counterparts, we cannot request documents to review ahead of time on these inspections. And for me, when I'm on a foreign site, I have my week to get in, do the work, and get out. So any requests for information from a vendor, such as audit trails or user acceptance testing, they have to be made after the inspection opening, which immediately puts me at a time crunch. We have to make judgment calls on where the inspection time should be focused and use our spidey sense, as others have called it, to try to locate the problem areas at an inspection site as quickly as possible. The above changes primarily apply to clinical investigator and sponsor inspections. The bioequivalence inspections I've done post-pandemic, they're still predominantly the same. Their structure doesn't really lend themselves to decentralization. And the majority of the BEQ centers I go to, they still rely on manpower and paper records to get the job done. All right, continuing the theme to DHTs, others have covered electronic patient reported outcomes and standalone devices for recording subject source data. And as I was saying, my recent inspections have mostly reflected this shift towards decentralization of study setup and implementation of DHTs. The data gathering technologies such as electronic patient reported outcomes feel nearly ubiquitous these days. And remote gathering of information such as blood glucose levels or blood pressure levels are something I see more of lately as well. But again, with this push to use these data gathering techniques, it comes the burden of understanding the use of it at the site level. Investigator sites that are used to seeing their subjects in person need to be properly trained on the use of the DHTs, as well as the responsibility for the oversight of the use of these devices on the subject end. And at the sponsor level, consideration must be given to the intended purposes and functions of the technology. Just a few issues I have seen in person, particular to ePro systems. I've seen ePro help desk users that are given edit access when the subjects call in and ask for help. But when the help desk user made the change, it persisted as the subject making the entry as opposed to the help desk user. I've also seen ePro systems that, by design, they requested large, consistent amounts of event reporting from subjects, and specifically subject caregivers in a sick pediatric population. And the same system prevented entry of information after 48 hours, leading to underreporting of events that had to be corrected after the fact. In that situation, there was no consideration given to the caregiver probably putting more focus on caring for the child than just churning data into an ePro. And I've also seen ePro systems where subjects are not trained on the proper reporting of the events that require modifications down the line, and it creates a large amount of event adjudication later. And typically with checking at the study step through the portal and has to get re-verified on inspection. So these three issues are ones that should have been considered in the design of the study prior to the implementation of the ePro. And from where I stand, the newness of the implementation on both sides and the general increase in the number of data movement pathways in these decentralized trials, it opens the door for errors that can affect data integrity and subject privacy. This increase in the number of potential vendors and systems used in clinical trials creates more potential pitfalls. Each link in the chain may work on the assumption that the next link is doing their job adequately with adequate systems of protection in place, but that's not always the case. And these weak links in the chain are something that I always put a heavy focus on when I show up at a sponsor or clinical investigator site. Changing the topic to real-world data, real-world evidence. I haven't done any of these inspections personally. It feels like industry is keen to leverage these large data sources where possible to support marketing applications. These sources can be very challenging to verify from an inspection standpoint. The collection of data, the ownership and maintenance of data sources such as oncology registries, just for example, pose challenges in the verification of the integrity of the data. And selection bias is a concern, as is proper consent for the use of the data and protection of the privacy of the individuals whose data was collected for this registry. That was not necessarily intended for inclusion in a marketing application. And I'd like to add another perspective from some of my colleagues. During meetings and discussions with colleagues about recent inspections in the post-pandemic era, I've also observed there's a split in their comfort levels of performing electronic data review. While it's an area that I'm keenly interested in, and I love diving deep into it, and I focus on it on every inspection, the fact is that until recently, Obama did not even have permission to access read-only systems and had to rely on over-the-shoulder activities to review vast TMFs and things like that. So the rise of the decentralization of trials and the implementation of all these numerous data streams to track and verify on an inspection, it's generated like a real interest and a need and increased data integrity training for our inspectorate to continue to be flexible and adapt to new ways of keeping inspections efficient, to review as much of the critical data as possible while on site in our limited time. Continuous training is a cornerstone of any enterprise, and regulatory inspections are no different. The changing landscape of clinical trials in the post-pandemic is certainly keeping us on our heels while doing our part to ensure that data quality is coming from the trials. All right. So we've reached the end of my brief overview of my personal view of these. So in summary, decentralization and the use of digital health technologies in clinical trials, they only appear to be increasing in scope. And they do offer real tangible benefits to study subjects and to study sites if they are properly organized, trained, and monitored for compliance with the study protocol. And RRAs or RAEs now are a new tool in our tool belt to evaluate compliance with regulations and are continuing to evolve in their function and scope. Keep your ears up for much more information on these in the coming presentations. And from my point of view, while decentralization and digital health technologies can be beneficial to sites and subjects, they do appear to be making FDA inspections of sites and sponsors more burdensome, especially in the international inspection area where you cannot feasibly extend inspection times. Careful planning and constant evaluation of where inspection focus should be spent is critical to properly gauge an inspection site's compliance with their responsibilities for a clinical trial and ensuring that the integrity of critical study data has been preserved throughout all phases of generation, storage, movement, and analysis. I'll leave you with the closing thought that the pandemic presented numerous challenges, but as long as we keep subject safety and rights and quality data control, I should add that in there, at the forefront, innovation can only improve the output of clinical research as long as regulatory review practices adapt accordingly. All right. Look forward to any of your questions later or at the end of the day, and I will pass it off to Lakeisha.
Thank you again, Richard, Jason, Jennifer, and Aram, for that very interesting presentation. Great information. As we continue, I'm going to move on to session 3, and I would like to welcome Dr. Kasa Ayalu and his presenters to the stage. They will be presenting the future of GCP inspections.
Thank you, Lakeisha. It's great, actually, that this will be, the next session will be on the future, about the future. It is a continuation of what we just heard about post-pandemic experience. And the future of GCP inspection, that's titled for our session. And we'll discuss about the experience and lesson learned during the COVID pandemic, and also focusing on different kind of tools, the agency in particular from FDA perspective, as well as from MHRA, that had been used during the pandemic, and also to discuss the pro and con of different kind of alternative data verification, whether remote regulatory assessment or remote inspection that other regulatory agency call. I mean, the names, we call it remote regulatory assessment. For example, our European colleagues tend to call it remote inspection. We have 3 speakers. 2 of them are in person here, and one is going to use alternative technology, and the presentation will be through video. And the first speaker will be Jen Seller, who is a branch chief from the Office of Scientific Investigation at the FDA, and joined by Lieutenant Jennifer Adams, who is the Director for Foreign Cadre from Office of Regulatory Affairs within the FDA. And Rachel Mates from MHRA-UK will be presenting her section through the video. And without further ado, I'm going to invite my colleague, Jen Sellers, to come to the podium and start her presentation. Thank you, Jen. And thank you, Jennifer, as well as Rachel.
Thank you, Casa. Good morning. Happy Valentine's Day. All right, I am going to spend 15 minutes to tell you about RRA, Remote Regulatory Assessment from Marketing Application Review point of view. Okay, so bear with me. 15 minutes. First, I'm going to share our experience of RRA during the pandemic, then the lessons we learned from the marketing application review perspective, and then future use of RRAs. So before we get to the topic of RRA, I would like to tell you a little bit what we do. So we, Office of Scientific Investigations, the center of CDER Center, we conduct compliance review for marketing applications, new drug applications, NDAs, BLA, biologic license applications. We cover GCP, routine GCP, not for cause. Our branch cover routine GCP inspections of clinical investigator, sponsor, and the CIOs. So these inspections for phase 1 bioequivalence studies are covered by different office, OSIS. We'll hear from them tomorrow. So now you know our purview. So let's take a look at the review process. So in this process, we collaborate with multiple stakeholders. MHRA, Health Canada, EMA, PMDA. We also collaborate with our own FDA coworkers. All right, here's the review division. We collaborate with them. And then ORA, Office of Regulatory Affairs. So you have heard from Foreign Country Director Barbara, Rick, and Jenna, our wonderful Jenna is here. So we collaborate with them. And when the review division receives NDAs, BLAs, and when GCP inspections are warranted, we collaborate with them and we make decisions which clinical investigators we wanted to inspect. We also decide whether we wanted to inspect a sponsor or CIOs. And once we make that decision, we generate inspection assignment memo, give very specific instructions about how the inspections will be conducted. And then ORA received inspection assignment memo, conduct inspections, and then send us back the inspection report. So we review all the inspection reports for the particular application, and we make CIS, Clinical Inspection Summary, and we make recommendations about data integrity and the study conduct adequacy. And we send the CIS to the review division, and then review division make regulatory decisions based on the reviews from all disciplines. All right, pandemic. Just like Jason just mentioned about the pandemic, it was only 4 years ago when hundreds, thousands of patients died from COVID in a day. So the pandemic has impacted almost every aspect of our life and work. GCP inspection was no exception. So how did we assess the impact of pandemic on GCP inspections? Again, we are talking about our purview, the inspections for routine PDUFA user fee applications. So we looked at total number of inspections in the fiscal year 15 to 21. So as you can see, in 2020, the total number of inspections dropped. And then 21 bounced back a little bit. So probably due to factors such as the availability of COVID vaccine. And then we also look into 5 years, the total number of inspections in the 5 years prior to the pandemic. and calculate the average, which was 418. So compared to the average, FY20 decreased 23%, and FY21, 6%. So FDA, like the other agencies around the world, responded to the pandemic quickly, adapted to the public health crisis, and used alternative tools to assess GCP compliance. So one of the tools we used was RRA. So I have a question for you. What is RRA? So is RRA a inspection? If you say yes, raise your hand. So if you say no, raise your hand. Thank you. Most said no. So the terminology of RRA has evolved. FDA issued first draft guidance in 2021, and then updated in 2022. And then most recently, last month, 2024, issued another draft guidance. So according to the most recent guidance, RRA is remote examination of FDA-regulated establishment and or its records to evaluate compliance with applicable FDA requirements. So the establishments here, I'm talking about, it's clinical investigator, sponsor investigator, sponsor, and CIOs. Most of you got it. So to FDA, RRA is not inspection. So as you can see, we have Venn diagram here. So the peach color represents inspection, turquoise, RRA. The overlap area represents the similarities, and the other areas, differences. Okay, so let's take a look at the inspection first. So FDA to FDA inspections is FDA officials physically enter the physical address of establishment, display the credentials like Rick mentioned. I'm here, I'm FDA, I'm here for inspection, and then present 482, that's the notice of inspection. And then when there are objectionable observations, FDA will issue 483. On the other hand, RRA is remote, and for GCP purpose, RRA is voluntary, which means when FDA requests RRA, the establishment can decline the request. However, if FDA determines GCP assessment is necessary, and if you decline the RRA, FDA may decide to have inspection. And then you don't get to opt out for inspection. All right, since RRA is not inspection, so there's no credentials, no 482s. However, if there are objectionable observations, those observations findings will not be documented in 483, but will be documented in writing. It's just not in 483 form. So let's take a look at the commonalities, the similarities between the inspection and the RRA. So both can have meetings either in person or virtual, both can verify data, both can assess compliance, and observations can be documented in writing, and FDA can take regulatory actions based on the observations. Doesn't matter, it's inspection or RRA. Now, let's take a look at the RAs that we have reviewed during the pandemic for FY20 and 21. So there were a total of 72 RAs conducted. So FY20, we had 39 RAs. The top 2 therapeutic area that these RRAs supported for approval, the first one is oncology. The second one is antiviral. Mostly it's anti-COVID drugs. In FY21, we had 33 RAs. Again, oncology was the first top therapeutic area that these RAs supported. The second one is rare diseases. Let's take a look at the RAs categories by application, submission, and whether it was designated as a mission critical. So as you can see, almost 70% of our RAs supported NDA, about 30% supported BLA, and then almost 80% of RAs supported original submissions, and then 20% for supplements. And then almost 60% of our RAs supported mission critical applications. And these are the RAs categories by establishment type and the locations of establishment. As you can see, 80% RAs were for clinical investigators and 20% for sponsor CIOs. And then about 80% of our RAs were for establishment outside the US. Lessons learned. This is what we learned from our perspective. RAs were useful in the assessment of data reliability, subject safety, and clinical trial conduct. RAs supported FDA's mission and informed regulatory decisions. So let's think about the benefits of RA. So RA is a valuable tool to verify data submitted. It allows FDA to assess GCP and regulatory compliance remotely to support regulatory decisions. It expands the breadth of FDA's GCP oversight. It has potential to save time and money. So you may ask, for the future use of RA, when may FDA request an RRA? The answer is whenever. Whenever FDA determines RA is useful, it's useful to help to assess the GCP compliance of establishments to support regulatory decisions, or when there are travel restrictions and then we cannot do inspections. Take-home message. RRA is a valuable tool for regulatory agencies to assess GCP compliance. All right. First, I'd like to thank our director, Dr. Ayalu, for the help with the slides, and then our site team for the work on the paper we published, and then our staff, GCPAB, for review of RA memo, and our wonderful ORA colleagues for conducting RAs. I have references here. The first one is the draft guidance published in January 2024. The second one is the paper we published. This concludes my presentation. Now I will turn over to Jenna, our ORA. She'll talk about her perspective of RRA. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Sellers, for that great perspective on RRAs and marketing authorization approval. So my name is Jennifer Adams, and I work for and represent here the Office of Bioresearch Monitoring Operations within the Office of Regulatory Affairs. I'll be beginning this discussion today discussing the evolution of the remote regulatory assessment through time. I'll be talking about RRAs in the transition to post-COVID and in our steady state. And then we'll close discussing RRAs looking towards the future. Now, I'll be the first to note that there is a bit of a disconnect between the session title, The Future of GCP Inspections, and the topics here. And implied in that disconnect is really the balance that we as an agency are trying to strike in terms of how we are going to incorporate this new tool of RRA into our regulatory toolbox. Now, new tools are good, and the pandemic has given us this amazing tool, RRAs. They served us well during the pandemic when we were unable to travel to so many destinations throughout the world, domestic and international. And they supported marketing review for our center colleagues in that time. You'll pick up on the fact that this is an evolving conversation, and the answer of where RRAs fits in depends a lot on who you ask and what they're trying to assess. There is a hope that RRAs can be a quicker, easier, cheaper equivalent to an inspection, but you'll see later on in my slides that that is just not always the case for GCP RRAs. Now, here as a representative for Office of Bioresearch Monitoring, we conduct the majority of GCP operations that this agency does. We did a little over 1,100 last year, including a quarter of which were in a foreign environment. There are other representatives of our agency that are here, for example, the Office of Study Integrity and Surveillance, who also conduct inspections and RRAs, for example, for bioanalytical, and you'll be hearing more about their perspectives and their use of this tool tomorrow. But the focus of this presentation really is on the Office of Bioresearch Monitoring and our experiences with GCP-focused RRAs. So for the next two slides, I've split the evolution of RRAs between foreign and domestic because the way these operations work are a little different in these two different scenarios. The first thing you'll notice is that RRAs existed prior to the pandemic. So we didn't call them RRAs at the time, but we did have tools for instances where we were unable to travel to conduct on-site inspections or unable to access records in the location where they were generated. We asked sponsors or clinical sites to conduct certified copies, make certified copies of records and ship them to a US location, usually a sponsor or a US agent for our review. You can tell that these were relatively rare in the pre-pandemic world, less than 5 per calendar year leading up to the pandemic. These pre-RRAs did involve interviews, although oftentimes those interviews were mediated through a CRO or sponsor representative. And the records request, importantly, was not iterative. So we asked for copies of certified records and we got what we got. There was no re-request for clarifying documentation, with one important difference between RRAs in the pre-pandemic versus RRAs today. Now, during the pandemic, as I mentioned, these really were our only way to assess study data and human subject protection and support application review. We began the pandemic with no SOPs. We had very limited access to and experience with the tools that we needed to conduct remote regulatory assessments. For example, teleconferencing, all of these tools we know now. And we had very limited understanding of what was required to move forward with RRAs, especially in the foreign arena. We ended up working with clinical investigator sites to obtain approval from their institutions and their data privacy officers. We encouraged them to reach out to their institutional ethics committees to ensure that the appropriate approvals were needed. And in some cases, sites, especially in the foreign arena, had to actually go out and reconsent subjects so their data could be electronically shared with FDA for our remote review. With the understanding during the pandemic, as my colleague Richard Burning mentioned, that we recognized these were not anyone's top priority during the pandemic. We had an ongoing infection, outbreaks occurred, mandatory closures, people had their own personal scenarios, clinical investigators were trying to treat patients still, and we had so many RRAs that were either declined due to, for example, data privacy issues, or canceled even at the last minute due to personal circumstances that precluded the conduct. Nonetheless, we were able to accomplish just shy of 35 RRAs. And if you're doing the math in your head and comparing to Dr. Seller's presentation, these RRAs actually include all RRAs that OBIMO conducted for all of the centers. So this would include centers and as well as OSIS outside of the office OSI. Over time, across the pandemic, we really evolved and developed this tool. We developed our SOPs. We gained much greater familiarity with the tools that we all know associated with remote work. And we gained a much greater understanding of how to conduct these RRAs, what the limitations are for human subject records review through painstaking experience. And we learned what types of inspection assignments were more suitable for this format than others. Now, on the domestic side, as I mentioned before, some differences. There was no real need for an RRA prior to the pandemic. We have investigators that are located all over the United States, and so access to facilities is not really an issue that we have there. But during the pandemic, we conducted just shy of 20 domestic RRAs each year, 2020 to 2021. You see the number drop in 2022 and then rise again in 2023. This is largely related to an institutional review board, RRA pilot, that I'll discuss in a little bit more detail in a few slides. Now, in September 2020, the Office of Bioresearch Monitoring Operations conducted an analysis. We wanted to look at applications for which at least one remote regulatory assessment and one on-site inspection were completed in support of the same application. We were looking for apples to apples comparison with two primary factors for consideration. The first being resource burn and the second being coverage. We ended up with 15 applications representing 33 on-site inspections and 25 RRAs. And I should note here that the majority of the on-site inspections were domestic, as you might imagine. The majority of the RRAs were foreign. So our first question, resource burn. How much time do these take? And this matters for you, the regulated industry, as well. The numbers presented on this slide is the number of hours that it takes an investigator to complete a given operation divided by the total number of operational hours for an investigator for a year. So this is the proportion of an investigator's year dedicated to a single operation, on average presented for RRAs and inspections. And what you're probably seeing is that the RRAs do take longer. In fact, in this analysis, 73% more time. Now, there is a caveat that has been raised on a couple of occasions that what if we were to incorporate travel into this analysis rather than just operational time, especially given that most of these RRAs are done in a foreign environment? It's a salient point. I think it's difficult for me to imagine how you would incorporate a counterfactual scenario into the analysis. You know, an investigator traveling from Savannah, Georgia to Frankfurt, how long their flight time would be. But it's a salient point that I think it would improve this comparison regarding resource burn. Not sure by how much, but it might improve that. Now let's look at our next main factor, coverage. You can tell on the left, RRA coverage, 95% of these were limited in one aspect. While for inspections of, again, apples to apples, same application, 97% were comprehensive. Now there's a number of reasons why RRAs may have been limited in this manner. The first and biggest one is that largely the records that we're receiving for RRAs are redacted of personal identifiers. This means names, dates of birth, signatures, identifying information has been removed from the records that we're reviewing, whereas on-site we would have access to those identified records. This can present a big challenge, and in particular looking at, for example, informed consent documentation, the linchpin of human subjects protection. We're unable to really assess meaningful informed consent documentation without any of the identifying information present. Second, it's difficult to assess internal consistency within records. So is this medical history that was uploaded for subject 12 really the same individual that was dosed at visit 3? Again, without identifiers, there's no way to link those two together, and we end up in a position where we just have to trust that the site has uploaded in good faith. And for this reason, these RRAs are not an ideal, they're a particularly poor solution for assignments where there's data integrity concerns, as you all might imagine. In addition, there were some instances, as Richard Burning mentioned, where due to resource limitations, our clinical investigator sites in particular were unable to share with us the full scope of records that we would have access to physically in an on-site inspection. You know, they just don't have the time and resources, especially during the pandemic, for us to expect them to scan every scrap of paper associated with voluminous trial records. In addition, some of these sites, as I mentioned before, had to have subjects come and reconsent to participate, have their records included in the remote regulatory assessment. In instances where subjects were not able to return to the sites to reconsent, or where they did not consent to having their records shared electronically, we were absent those records for our remote reviews. And then lastly, there were some instances where sites told us due to their data privacy regulations, they were unable to share certain records with us wholesale. And so in those instances, we had to come and review what records they were allowed to share with us as best we could. Now, this is one of the biggest concerns about RRAs, really, and specifically GCP RRAs, that's inherent to the types of records that we're reviewing. These are not batch records, they're not manufacturing records, they're not analysis records, they're not records about process. Ultimately, at the end of the day, these are records about human subjects. And this is why conceptually RRAs seem very straightforward, but in practice can be very challenging. So now we turn to the steady state, 2023. The first thing that you notice is the numbers have decreased since the pandemic. When and where we've been able to travel, we do to conduct on-site inspections with the understanding that they are our gold standard that we can offer and we owe to our center counterparts in the review of applications and ultimately to the American consumer to ensure the products that they're accessing are safe and effective. The second thing you'll notice is there's this bolus of IRB RRAs, Institutional Review Board RRAs. This is related to a pilot project that OBIMO has been conducting with the Center for Drug Evaluation, Center for Biologics, and Center for Device and Radiological Health, where we're looking at a voluntary option of IRBs participating in RRAs. Now, there's a number of factors that are considered when determining which types of assignments are best suited for this pilot project, including inspection history, study types that are under review at a particular IRB, and various other logistical factors. Now, this team is still finalizing their analysis, but 2 points that I'll highlight preliminarily is that these IRBs, RRAs, did actually take more time than their on-site inspection counterparts, something that we know and recognize from our prior analysis, but that there was a certain amount of additional scheduling flexibility due to the lack of travel. Now, it's notable that there are no CI or sponsor or CRO RRAs in 2023. This is really the bread and butter of our program, our GCP program in OBIMO. This is due to the resource and coverage concerns that I expressed in earlier slides, but also an increasing concern about the legality of electronic transfer of clinical records globally. I mentioned before, there are reconsent issues at stake, there's an extensive redaction process, and we're often going about these feasibility negotiations via an interpreter in a different language over Zoom. It's just very challenging. So when we can travel to conduct on-site inspections, we are. With the understanding that, as Dr. Sellers mentioned, RRAs are not inspections, they're not equivalent. Now, other programs like food and drug manufacturing programs have been folding RRAs into their work plan. But there is something about especially international transfer of sensitive private information regarding the health of human subjects via an electronic portal that makes GCP RRAs really unique. So let's look towards the future. FDA issued a guidance document in 2022 that was recently updated, and there's actually another additional guidance document that's specific to BIMO. Both of these documents are out at the SBIA booth, so if you have a chance, go stop by and read a copy. But this guidance document indicates, as Dr. Sellers mentioned, that FDA can initiate or request an RRA whenever deemed appropriate, using a risk-based approach that includes the location of a firm, their inspection history, the complexity of the assignment, and any travel restrictions. So to summarize, RRAs are still very much a valuable tool in our toolbox. No one knows when the next potential global pandemic could hit. In addition, there are unique circumstances, even in a post-COVID world, where RRAs are going to be appropriate. The thing is, we have to come into these decisions with the understanding of the limitations of this tool and ensure that we're incorporating that understanding into our risk-based decision. So with that, I will turn this over to my MHRA colleague, Rachel Mead, for her recorded presentation.
Hello everyone, I am Rachel Mead, a Senior GCP Inspector at the MHRA. I'll be presenting about GCP inspections that we conduct, as well as the future of those. So when conducting a GCP inspection, MHRA inspectors are examining compliance of an organisation's clinical trial research procedures and systems in accordance with the UK Statutory Instrument 2004-1031. That's the Medicines for Human Use Clinical Trials Regulations and its subsequent amendments, including 2006-1928. This gives inspectors the right to inspect any site involved in UK clinical trial activities and also describes the fees that are to be charged. The Human Medicines Regulations also give rights of access, powers of inspection, sampling and seizure, as well as describing the findings and reporting of inspections. These regulations also make it a criminal offence to obstruct an inspector during the conduct of an inspection. In terms of the types of GCP inspections performed, we have a national risk-based programme. So these inspections are generally systems-based, meaning that inspectors examine the systems and procedures used to conduct clinical research in the UK by both commercial and non-commercial organisations to comply with existing national GCP regulations. But GCP risk scheduling is challenging, as the GCP ecosystem is a constantly changing environment. So there's no requirement to be registered or licensed to conduct clinical trials, and organisations are often closing, merging, emerging all the time. And that makes the GCP inspection universe very difficult to know and manage. We perform triggered inspections, usually as a result of information received by the MHRA about suspected violations of legislation relating to the conduct of clinical trials. We also accredit organisations conducting phase 1 trials, in particular those conducting first-in-human trials. And that scheme aims to make sure trials are as safe as possible and to create public confidence in the regulation of phase 1 trials. We also conduct marketing authorisation application inspections, as well as joint inspections with other agencies. As mentioned, inspectors have the right to inspect any site involved in clinical trial activities in the UK. So the types of organisations inspected is many and very varied. So this can range from small GP surgeries, who are maybe an investigator site on one trial, up to large global commercial sponsors, and really everything in between. So typically an MHRA GCP inspection will consist of 3 main parts. First of those is planning. So you'll receive a notification from the head of GCP with a request for information about your organisation. We call this a dossier, and also information about the trials that you conduct. Once received, that's reviewed by your allocated lead inspector, and they'll be in touch to arrange the inspection and provide a plan for its conduct. The second part then is the inspection itself. So that will start with an opening meeting to provide details of the scope of the inspection. During the inspection, there'll be document and data review, a review of systems, interview sessions with relevant personnel involved in the trials selected, and really that's the personnel doing the tasks, not the management, and maybe a facility tour. Lastly, there'll be a closing meeting where provisional feedback on inspection findings will be presented, as well as an outline of the next steps. So if there's any critical findings that are identified during your inspection, they'll be referred to the Inspection Action Group, who are a non-statutory multidisciplinary group which advise on recommendations for regulatory action. And then the third and final part, after the inspection, you'll receive a report of the findings and you'll provide a CAPA in response. And once that's accepted, a GCP inspection statement will be provided to close the inspection. But prior to this pandemic, GCP inspectors were already making use of remote inspections. So whether that was prior to the on-site inspection, as we've described, with a day one evaluation, or instead of an on-site inspection. So for example, for GCP, this has included a review of specific systems. So for example, the remote review of pharmacovigilance for clinical trials with a focus on the reference safety information. But we've also used remote inspections for taking place after an on-site inspection where there were significant issues to follow up. However, the shift during the pandemic was to complete only essential on-site inspections. So this included some triggered inspections plus those to support COVID-19. Therefore, we had to shift to mostly remote inspections. So for GCP, we prioritise systems that lend themselves to remote review. So many organisations have an ETMF, which we could easily review remotely. And with the increasing use of technology, there's a focus on how data integrity is maintained and how this is controlled, including who controls the data and is able to change it. But we try to be pragmatic, reducing burden wherever possible, particularly for those organisations on the front line. We did this as a risk-based approach, so NHS sites were not inspected unless critical to enable essential COVID-19 work to continue. Trials are evolving and becoming more complex and adaptive in design with multiple arms, many e-systems, lots of different vendors. So naturally, with such trials, there is a focus on the sponsor oversight and how they keep track of all those changes and ensuring there are effective change control measures in place. So, for example, if an amendment requires updates to multiple documents, plans, e-systems, and so on. In order to facilitate remote inspections, we've used document exchange platforms to upload our written requests, as well as receive documents, and have found some platforms to be much more user-friendly than others. And you'll also hear more about remote and hybrid BE, so bioequivalence inspections, tomorrow from my colleague, Michael McGuinness. So what are the expectations regarding research conducted during the pandemic? So we know that due to the pressures on frontline staff and resources, prioritisation of trials had to take place at sites, with decisions on pausing recruitment and halting some trials in their entirety. We saw this right across trials from phase 1, first in human, but right through to phase 4 trials. The MHRA issued guidance on managing these trials in a huge cross-agency effort, as well as we all had to come together really to understand how to navigate this unprecedented situation. As the pandemic unfolded, it became apparent that there'd be a significant effect on the data that could be collected from ongoing trials. So with patient visits limited, the data collected would be less, and depending on the criticality of that data, this could mean that the trial objectives may not be met. So in this case, we'd advise that sponsors come and speak to the regulator about this. We also expect to see an increase in the number of protocol deviations, it is expected that a risk-based approach is taken to the documentation of those protocol deviations. So deviations that impact on participant safety and the reliability of results should be identified, documented, and then taken into account when that data is analysed. Minor protocol deviations should also be identified, and these can be documented at a trial level, so rather than at an individual level. So, for example, documenting that participant visits that were performed remotely, or perhaps that IMP was delivered directly to participants at home where this was not originally intended. Questions have also arisen in relation to the quality of the data, so where on-site monitoring has not been able to be carried out, a remote monitoring has occurred in its place. Some sponsors have felt that once it's safe to be back on site, that remonitoring would need to take place. So we'd advise that this is done on a risk-based approach. Therefore, if there are concerns about data quality or there's data that's critical to the reliability of the results of the trial, such that you'd only have confidence in that data if monitoring took place. But we certainly wouldn't see the need for remonitoring in all cases. And also trial teams had to navigate participants receiving their COVID-19 vaccines during trials and then the unblinding of treatment in those vaccine trials without compromising the trial data. So what did these remote inspections highlight? We continued our routine national risk-based inspection programme, as well as inspections of sponsors, CROs, labs and investigator sites, both for vaccines and antiviral medications. Sponsors and CROs had to set up and conduct clinical trials in a really short space of time and had to implement many new processes. So whilst it's essential to ensure processes are defined to assure the quality of the trial and these should be followed, it was not unexpected that there were some issues due to the pressure people were under. However, it is important to identify the findings for those to be considered by inspectees in relation to the conduct of these and other trials. So I just wanted to highlight a few areas of non-compliance which really were quite specific to these trials and the times that we were in. We saw an increased use of consent by professionals, so as opposed to personal legal representatives from the investigator site for consenting of adults lacking capacity. This was because personal legal representatives were not being allowed into hospitals. We also had findings identified as legal representatives were not always independent of the trial, so sometimes they were the PI or a sub-investigator. And there was also use of verbal consent only due to the strict infection control measures in place and the use of paper in hospitals. But that's not in compliance with UK law, the trial's ethical approval, or indeed the protocol. We also saw the use of deferred consent, where a sponsor had informed investigator sites that consent was not required prior to randomisation. And there were also findings because participants were not consented once they'd regained capacity. We saw the use of data from registries, for example, the date of hospital discharge, or ethnicity data, or date of death. And it was given preference over the data entered into the ECRF and authorised by a PI. There was lack of data integrity controls of laboratory data, including data being generated in a modifiable format and saved to an unsecure location, and also insufficient audit trails. We also identified that there was no evidence of samples for the primary endpoint being processed or frozen as per protocol requirements. The fast setup of ECRFs meant delays in applying edit checks, leading to non-compliance not being detected and preventative actions not being implemented in a timely manner. We also saw that non-commercial sponsor teams had edit access to the ECRF, but those changes then didn't subsequently require PI approval. We also saw that monitoring was not implemented until really quite high numbers of participants had been recruited, or a failure to identify non-compliances which could impact on the safety of participants or data integrity, and also a lack of monitoring at local labs which were responsible for management of the samples for a primary endpoint. So we really did learn a lot during the pandemic, and researchers, regulators and those that generously participated in trials had achieved a lot really in a short space of time. And this is built on key areas such as early engagement for development of medicines, working across networks not only to deliver trials, but to deliver efficacious products into the market when safe to do so, with the end goal of getting new and innovative products to patients much, much sooner. So where does this take us? Remote inspections have been a success. We know we were able to maintain oversight, ensuring patient safety and public health, as well as identifying critical issues, and they will continue to be used in the future. There have been process improvements too, so that's particularly around document sharing and the use of MS Teams for that, as well as using it for video calls and the large numbers of staff joining interviews. This is also a modernisation of inspections. Inspectors really are working in the same way as those being inspected, and that is remotely. Many trials are globally run with teams spread far and wide, with very little paper used. There's less of a need to be sat in a conference room at the company headquarters to look at a laptop when companies are now paper light. It also reduces the carbon footprint of our agency. We can access a number of systems remotely too, so the ECRF, the ETMF, but ePro and health records too. That being said, it isn't possible to do everything remotely. Can you tour a facility efficiently without a camera crew and a host? You know, we have done this, but it is hard work. Can we look at individual computers or equipment? So look at system settings, network connections, you know, serial numbers, or even physical verification of IMP supplies. It's also not easy. You know, we've had to adapt our skills as inspectors, including managing effective interviews online and often with many more people, as it's obviously easier to dial into a call than to fly halfway across the world for an on-site inspection. And also manage access to lots of e-systems and the associated training that comes with them. But we have received a positive response from industry. We know it supports the health and safety of the company staff too. It allows for greater flexibility with work schedule of inspectees and is a motivation to continue standards of compliance, you know, even in times of extreme change. It's also fair to say that our profile has been raised during the last few years, so it's especially important to make sure we continue to increase the trust and confidence of the public in the regulators, but also it facilitates maintenance of the pharmaceutical supply chain, it enables oversight of clinical trial activities, and continues to promote access to promising innovative therapy. So what's ahead for us? Well, the Medicines and Medical Devices Act of 2021 provides us the power to update the legislation for clinical trials. So this brings the opportunity, with us having now left the European Union, to design a world-class sovereign regulatory environment for clinical trials that will support the development of innovative medicines and legislation that reflects innovative trial design and delivery. The new international recognition procedure, so IRP, went live on January the 1st in order to speed up the licensing process by allowing access to the expertise of other trusted regulatory partners, including those in Canada and the USA. So the MHRA will retain ultimate authority to accept or reject applications submitted under the IRP, but the shared global expertise fundamental in the IRP process is designed to result in a more rapid, efficient and cost-effective process for applicants. As part of this procedure, we'll also be restarting a programme of MAA inspections. So previously we conducted these when we were part of the EU, and as these are valuable, we're going to incorporate these further into our inspection programme going forward. So thank you very much for your time today.
Apologies. Thank you, Rachel. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So I'm back to provide a summary from FDA and MHRA perspective. GCP RRAs are a valuable tool for regulatory authorities to assess compliance, but will not replace GCP inspections due to their limitations, which we must recognize. And also preparation for on-site or remote inspections is pretty similar. Document review, interviews, and document requests from the MHRA perspective don't change just because an inspector is in their home office rather than a conference room in your head office. I believe that's all that we have. I'll call Commander Williams up.
Well, we are working it with the timing, very efficient. So thank you, everyone, and please join me in thanking our panelists again. They have really done a phenomenal job with the presentations have just been really informative. So I want to thank them again. So it is time for lunch. Please, again, as I've mentioned yesterday, please be kind if you see a speaker in line because they are on a time crunch so they can be back in time for their slot. But please enjoy your lunch and take advantage of facilities inside and feel free to venture outside. We will see you back at 1:12. Thank you.